Tyrion Lannister always believed the gods had a sense of humor. How else could one explain the curious shape of his body and the mind that burned so bright within it? Dwarfed by his siblings in both height and the glimmer of familial affection, Tyrion had learned early to wield his wits as ably as Jaime wielded a sword. Yet for all his cleverness, for all his capacity to observe the great stage of Westeros and find it wanting, Tyrion never foresaw himself trudging through a sea of snow at the world's lonely edge, a black cloak flapping in the wind behind him. He never imagined that one day he would be called Lord Commander. But the realm's greatest stories often spun from such improbable threads, and so it was that Tyrion of House Lannister, reviled imp of Casterly Rock, took the black and found a strange sort of power at the wall. His journey north began in the gloom of a dark cell in King's Landing. Cersei's voice had rung through his nightmares, repeating accusations that clung to him like a rancid smell. The bells of the city tolled for yet another funeral, for a nephew this time, and Tyrion stood accused of regicide. The trial was a carefully laid farce. Every eye in King's Landing seemed thirsty for the spectacle. The dwarf on trial for killing a king, indeed, that was a story fit for the tongues that wagged all across the Seven Kingdoms. Tyrion knew he was innocent, or at least not nearly as guilty as they claimed, but that mattered little. So many in power wanted to see him bleed, especially his father and sister. All of it was orchestrated. A Lannister always paid his debts, and he had incurred many in his short lifetime. He had expected to die that day, to be thrown to the headsman or skewered by a champion in trial by combat. But the gods, if they truly existed, had other designs. On the eve before his sentencing, Varys had come to him in the darkness. The eunuch's whisper was softer than a mouse's step, but to Tyrion's ears it was a drumbeat of possibility. There was a bargain to be made, a quiet arrangement for gold and safe passage, for the spider always had a web extending in every direction. Tyrion hated the idea of leaving Westeros behind, but the choice was stark: the executioner's blade or a desperate flight across the narrow sea. He chose flight, of course. He had no illusions that the city he'd once tried to save would ever celebrate him. There was no future for him in King's Landing, and perhaps not in all of Westeros. Yet even his flight did not go as planned. On the ship bound for Pentos, a notion festered in his mind. What would he do on the other side of the sea, a dwarf with a questionable name and enemies enough to fill a library of ledgers? Spend his days drinking and whoring until the last coin vanished? The very thought felt hollow. He did not want to be a puppet of this or that master, dancing upon a stage in Bravos or Meereen, gathering petty coin for men who despised the Lannister name but were too craven not to use it for their own ends. No, Tyrion Lannister, imp, dwarf, second son, he wanted to matter. He wanted to serve some purpose beyond a new cycle of indignities. He had once traveled north to the Wall out of curiosity. Back then, he'd drunk with Benjen Stark and conversed long into the night with the men of the Night's Watch. Men who had lost everything, abandoned everything, or had everything taken from them. He had walked along the top of that immense barrier of ice and gazed into the terrible emptiness beyond. Strange how it called to him now in his darkest moment, offering a bitter taste of redemption. Or if not redemption, then at least a place with no illusions of grandeur, a place that might allow him to do some modicum of good, if only for himself. The vow replayed in his memory. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It was an oath for exiles, for the broken, for men at the ends of roads. He fit neatly into that category. So he persuaded the ship's captain to sail him back to the north instead of across the narrow sea. It cost him in coin and cunning, for the man was petrified of offending Lord Tywin Lannister or the Iron Throne. But Tyrion's honeyed words and final pouches of gold convinced him. Thus the imp found himself deposited on the stony shores near Eastwatch by the sea under the cover of darkness. A single battered chest to his name, and 1,000 regrets swirling in his heart. He looked up at the looming shape of the ice fortress and thought, this is where a man truly disappears. He came to the gates under a cloak of sable furs, hood drawn low over his mismatched eyes. The guards recognized him anyway. Who else had that sardonic half-smile on so small a face? But they let him pass. Perhaps they sensed he had nowhere else to go. It was a short trek from Eastwatch to Castle Black, though the wind bit fiercely, and Tyrion had to wrap himself tightly to keep from freezing in the saddle. He felt every jolt of the horse's gait. He was no natural rider, though he managed. Along the way, he had time to reflect on how many times he had tried to avoid truly belonging anywhere. At the wall, belonging might not be as vital. The men were bound by their oath, not affection. Yet there was also a camaraderie among them that he had observed all those years ago, a fellowship forged by shared duty. When he arrived at Castle Black, the new Lord Commander, a humorless knight from the Crownlands, looked at him askance. "You want to join the watch?" the man asked, as though Tyrion might be jesting. But the lordling was not jesting. He repeated his vow, fresh in his mind, the vow he had only read about but never fully uttered. He spoke with quiet conviction. His words echoed in the drafty hall, and for a moment, it seemed the entire keep fell silent. Then the Lord Commander gave a single curt nod. They had their newest brother. Life in Black was every bit as miserable as Tyrion had predicted. The cold seeped into his bones with every passing day, and the austere rations at the communal table only made him long for the feasts of the Red Keep. He found solace in the library, such as it was, a dusty place neglected by many of the Black brothers. There, he pored over books and scrolls about the history of the Watch, about the mysteries that lurked beyond the wall, and about the precarious architecture of the realm's politics. He kept to himself whenever possible, mindful that many of his brothers were criminals and cast-offs who resented him or simply didn't care to make conversation. A few recognized his name and spat at the notion of a Lannister in their midst, but Tyrion endured their glares with the same stoicism he had once displayed at royal court. He told himself he had come here to vanish, to find a place among the ranks, not to stand out. But stand out he did. He had a way with words, a brilliance that couldn't be contained. When the quartermaster discovered that the new recruit could read and write far better than most of the garrison, Tyrion was enlisted to help with logs, supply orders, and ravens. Not that Tyrion minded. He might not have been good with a sword, but a quill that he could wield like a master fencer. Soon enough, the men began to rely on him for his cunning, for clever solutions to problems that swords and discipline failed to solve. Some nights, over a bowl of thin stew, he'd find himself advising the first builder on how best to patch a section of collapsed tunnel, or counseling the master-at-arms on how to settle a brewing feud between two sworn brothers. His counsel was always forthright, tinged with cynicism, and shot through with the realism of a man who knew how power worked. Even so, the path to acceptance was rocky. Tyrion wasn't cut out for swordplay or archery, and the daily drills left him winded and bruised. The Black brothers were not kind about his failures, though he suspected some of the jeering was no harsher than what they dished out among themselves. To them, he was just another recruit who needed to learn to fight. After one particularly brutal sparring session, in which he ended up flat on his back with a bloodied lip, Tyrion reflected that no blow of the training swords felt half as painful as the words his father once spat at him. He pressed his hand to his split lip and thought, "At least these bruises will heal." Slowly, the resentment of his presence began to fade. He shared his wine rations, told sardonic tales in the common hall, and placed careful bets on the dice games that often took place after the evening meal. He used his barbed wit to puncture the tension among the men, turning hot-headed arguments into laughter. Men started calling out to him in greeting, offering him a seat by the fire. They might not have called him friend, but they recognized him as a fellow brother bound by oath. Over time, Tyrion's mind found new corners to explore. He realized that the old records in the library didn't just hold dusty accounts of the Watch's history, they contained vital knowledge about the area beyond the wall, its geography, the stories of wildling tribes, and ancient sightings of the others. Tyrion's curiosity flared. He remembered how in his first visit, Jon Snow had spoken gravely about the possibility of a rising threat in the far north. Tyrion hadn't believed it then, not truly, but now, with so many strange tales reaching Castle Black, wildlings fleeing from some nameless dread, mysterious lights glimpsed in the distance, he began to wonder. Late at night, he would huddle by a guttering candle and read about the Long Night, about Bran the Builder, about the legends that had shaped the Watch's founding. He turned these mysteries over and over in his mind. The puzzle of the Great Other, the White Walkers, the threat that every man of the Watch was pledged to face, it all gave him purpose beyond the walls of the keep. 3 years passed, slowly at first, then in a blur of routine. Tyrion survived the bitter winters, endured the occasional rebellion from exiled knights or men who had had enough of this harsh life, and proved himself useful enough that the old Lord Commander, aged beyond his years by the unrelenting cold and the burdens of command, began to rely on Tyrion's advice for more than just supply matters. Tyrion learned to brace himself in a fight, to aim a crossbow with surprising accuracy, and to stand his ground in an argument with men who could snap him in half. He cultivated alliances with those of a more flexible mindset, recognizing that even here, power structures existed. The Watch was not immune to politics. Men were men, vow or no vow. So it was that when the old Lord Commander's health finally failed him, no one was too surprised to see the senior officers come to Tyrion for counsel. But Tyrion was stunned when he realized the shape of their intentions. "You should stand for the Lord Commandership," the first steward told him one evening, the man's voice shaking from a mixture of cold and nerves. "The senior officers will put your name forward." Tyrion nearly laughed in the steward's face. He, Lord Commander? A man who had come here to flee from his sins and hide from a realm that wanted him dead? It seemed preposterous. Yet, as the steward explained, no single ranger commanded the loyalty of all the Watch. The leading rangers were men of skill but few words, lacking in a broad perspective. The stewards, the builders, they respected Tyrion's knowledge, his willingness to see beyond petty feuds. Moreover, rumors had spread of some new threat stirring beyond the wall, a gathering of wildlings, or possibly something far worse. The men needed a leader who could think, not just swing a sword. And they believed Tyrion Lannister could do exactly that. "It's madness," Tyrion whispered that evening in his small cell, pulling the thin blanket to his chin as the wind rattled the shutters. Yet he couldn't deny that a tiny flicker of satisfaction glowed within him at the idea. Once he had been the master of coin, a role he performed well enough, though overshadowed by his father's contempt and the intrigues of King's Landing. Here, in the far north, he could actually lead men towards something that mattered, something that might change the fate of the realm. He turned the notion over, remembering the humiliations he had endured under Tywin's roof, the scorn from Cersei, the betrayal by Shae, and the memory of that crossbow in his hands. If the Watch wanted him as Lord Commander, why not seize this improbable chance? And so, when the assembly convened to elect a new Lord Commander, Tyrion stood in the midst of the Black brothers, a curious hush enveloping them. Men recalled his wise words, his pragmatic approach to governance, his cunning that had staved off more than one crisis. The Rangers admitted that he might not be a swordsman of renown, but he knew how to position archers along the wall and how to negotiate with the merchants who supplied their desperately needed goods. He knew how to talk to wildlings, if talk was possible, and he listened more than he boasted, a trait often lacking among the more martial candidates. The vote was closer than some would have liked, but in the end, Tyrion received the majority of tokens, and amid both cheers and muttered reservations, the dwarf was elevated to the 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He stared at the old cloak of black fur that had once belonged to his predecessor, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Then he stared around at the men who would be his brothers for however long this dark life lasted, and he bowed his head in acceptance. Lord Commander Tyrion Lannister. If his father had been alive to see it, Tyrion thought he would have sneered in disgust at the very idea. But the man was dead, shot on the privy by a crossbow bolt that still haunted Tyrion's dreams. Perhaps the Lannister legacy was safer in Jaime's hands, or so Tyrion hoped, though he didn't dwell on Casterly Rock anymore. He had bigger concerns now. The first weeks of Tyrion's command tested him in every way imaginable. Winter approached, and the supply lines from the south were erratic. Coal, salted meats, grains, much of it was delayed or lost to bandits on the road. Reports came from beyond the wall, sightings of large wildling warbands, rumors of a king beyond the wall rallying the free folk. Some insisted the others were stirring, that cold winds carried the moans of restless undead. Tyrion didn't know what to believe, but he remembered the accounts in the library. The others were real once, and perhaps they were real again. He responded as best he could. He dispatched ranging parties under the leadership of the most stalwart veterans, men who had no illusions about glory, only the grim duty of survival. He strengthened the defenses of Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower. He reallocated resources to ensure the archers had enough arrows, that the forges stayed lit, that the men could keep warm and fed. Whenever a brother grumbled about the new changes, Tyrion took the time to explain the necessity, relying on his natural gift for persuasion. He discovered that leadership in Black resembled leadership anywhere. You had to balance fear and respect, keep men's bellies full enough and their hearts aimed at a common cause. There were days he found it invigorating, other days he'd collapse onto his hard cot, exhausted beyond measure, wishing only for a goblet of fine wine. But whinging aside, he took pride in the small triumphs. The men started calling him the little lion, half affectionately, half in jest. He didn't mind. At least they were united. As the weeks turned to months, he found that he indeed had a knack for command. Perhaps he lacked martial prowess, but men followed wit as readily as steel when the days were grim enough. Then came the first true test of his command. A wildling raiding party slipped past the patrols, striking south of the wall, burning homesteads and capturing supplies. A raven arrived detailing their path, and panic spread among the watchers. The wildlings had grown bolder since the days of Mance Rayder. Tyrion called a council of his senior officers. They clamored for immediate retaliation, some urging him to lead the party himself, others advising caution. Tyrion listened, fingers steepled, his mind turning over every piece of information. He recalled how sometimes, with a well-placed bit of misinformation or a cunning feint, an enemy could be made to disperse rather than face direct confrontation. So he hatched a plan. They would dispatch 3 ranger groups to harry the wildlings, but not attack them outright, merely confuse their path, drive them toward a choke point near the Miltwater. There, a larger contingent, personally overseen by Tyrion's most trusted commander, would ambush them. Meanwhile, Tyrion himself would remain at the wall, safeguarding against any trick or second wave. Some of the men balked, calling it cowardice for the Lord Commander not to ride out. But Tyrion shook his head, explaining that the greatest risk was leaving the wall vulnerable to a larger assault. The wildlings might be employing deception themselves, and the watch couldn't afford to be drawn away. "I wish to protect our home," Tyrion said. "A fortress unguarded isn't a fortress at all. Let the wildlings walk into our net, not lure us into theirs." The plan worked. The rangers cleverly misled the wildling party, scattering them into the ambush. Few were killed, most surrendered, starved, and desperate. The Black brothers took them captive, gleaning bits of vital information. Tyrion made a point to question them personally, wanting to know more about the brewing situation beyond the wall. The wildlings spoke of a great gathering, tribes uniting under a single banner to flee something terrible in the far north. "They come," one wildling woman whispered, eyes haunted. "They come for all of us." Tyrion felt an involuntary shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. He let most of the captives live, offering them a chance to take the Black or be escorted to the gift's edges. Some took the oath, others spat in his face. Tyrion didn't begrudge them. He knew what it felt like to hate, but the intelligence they provided was invaluable. It lent weight to the rumors that a new king beyond the wall, perhaps the son or successor of Mance, was rallying the scattered wildlings to find safe haven this side of the wall. And if the stories of the others were even half true, then Tyrion had to consider what that meant for the entire Night's Watch. He conferred with Maester Mullen, an old man with watery eyes who had replaced Maester Aemon after his passing. Mullen was no match for Aemon's wisdom or experience, but he was dutiful and well-read enough to understand the seriousness of these developments. "We must prepare for a large influx of wildlings," Tyrion told him. "Better they join us than they join the army of the dead, if the dead indeed march." Mullen pressed his lips together, the lines of his face etched with concern. "We have precious little to sustain ourselves already," he said. But Tyrion lifted a finger. "Yes, so we must look to the south for alliances. I know the 7 kingdoms despise the Watch or ignore it, but it's time we make them see reason. Winter is coming." And so he began a campaign of ravens. Letters soared to the lords of the north, to the Vale, even to the Riverlands. He was careful not to sign them as Tyrion Lannister, the imp. Instead, he wrote as the Lord Commander, the shield that guards the realms of men. He explained that something dire was afoot, that the free folk were fleeing a threat beyond their comprehension, and that the Watch needed men, steel, supplies, anything the realm could spare. Some letters went unanswered, some returned with curt refusals. But to his relief, a few bore fruit. Small houses in the north remembered the old ways, the sworn duty to protect the realm. Wagons arrived with barley and salted fish, and a handful of young men took the road to Castle Black, seeking to take the Black themselves. It was a trickle, not a flood, but it was something. Time pressed on. Tyrion's days were consumed by the tasks of leadership, mediating disputes, planning rangings, writing pleas to southern lords. He rarely had a moment to himself, and when he did, he found his mind drifting back to a solitary question: was he truly making a difference, or was this just another ephemeral step in a life cursed by the Lannister name? That doubt gnawed at him, but each time he looked around and saw men working in quiet harmony, repairing walls, forging weapons, drilling in the yard, he realized that yes, he was accomplishing something here that he never could have in King's Landing. He was forging a unity of purpose, however fragile, among some of the realm's most desperate souls. It was a strange sort of satisfaction that warmed him in the cold nights. Then came the day the horn blew 3 times. Tyrion was in the courtyard, watching a sparring match between 2 new recruits when the long, chilling note echoed across the stone. It was a sound he'd only read about, a sound no living man had heard in centuries, according to the archives. 1 blast for rangers returning, 2 for wildlings, 3 for the others. The 3rd blast reverberated through the bones of Castle Black. Men dropped what they were doing, eyes gone wide with terror. Tyrion felt his heart hammer in his chest. Could it be? He rushed up the winding stairs to the top of the wall, every breath burning in his lungs. There, the wind whipped at his black cloak and he grabbed hold of the icy rampart to steady himself. Brothers pointed toward the vast white expanse beyond. Tyrion saw figures in the distance, dark silhouettes against the snow moving with an eerie, relentless gait. He couldn't yet make out their features, but the hush that fell over the Black Brothers told him all he needed to know. This was not a simple wildling raid. Something unnatural approached. At once Tyrion barked orders. Men scrambled, lighting signal fires, preparing tar-tipped arrows, rousing every able-bodied brother to the top of the wall or the gates below. The watchers on the heights shouted down what they saw, an army of corpses, skin pale and eyes aglow with something cold and malevolent. And among them, tall slender shapes on pale horses with eyes of icy blue. The White Walkers were not myth, not rumor. They were here, at the threshold of the living world. Panic threatened to seize the men, but Tyrion's voice cut through the rising din. He had to remind them of their duty, remind them that the wall had stood for thousands of years. With a deftness he'd honed in the courts of King's Landing, he shifted from frantic dread to stern leadership. Archers, knock arrows. Light them from the braziers. Rangers, ready the scorpions. I want oil poured along the outer edges of the battlements. He dashed from one group to another, encouraging them, shouting orders, trying to maintain order in the face of an enemy no living man had confronted in so long. The monstrous host advanced, slow but unstoppable. Some shapes peeled away, searching for weaknesses in the ice. Others brandished weapons of strange, glimmering material, like shards of crystal kissed by moonlight. Tyrion remembered the old texts that spoke of dragonglass and Valyrian steel. He cursed that they had so little of it. Every arrow that soared downward burned bright in the gloom, some finding their mark, others hissing into the snow. Now and then, a wight collapsed in flames, but so many more marched behind. For hours that felt like days, the men of the Night's Watch repelled wave after wave of undead trying to breach the gates. The main structure of the wall still stood strong, its ancient magic deterring the others themselves from crossing easily. But the wights hurled themselves at the gates, piling high, clawing and shrieking, until the watchers poured boiling oil on them or set them aflame. The stench of burning flesh choked the air. Tyrion coughed, tears streaming from the smoke as he oversaw the defense. It was near dawn when the horde finally began to retreat. The others pulled back in silence, their glowing eyes fixed on the defenders. No words were exchanged, merely a withdrawal, the undead shuffling away into the swirling snow. Tyrion felt no relief, only an uncanny fear. This had been a probing attack, he realized, a test of the Watch's defenses. The others would return, perhaps in greater numbers, and next time they might not be content to merely probe. In the aftermath, the courtyard was a scene of horror. Dozens of Black Brothers lay dead or dying, some burned or frozen, some missing limbs. The moans of the wounded echoed. Tyrion walked among them, haggard and heartsick, kneeling beside each man who reached out, offering what scant comfort he could. The rest of the day was spent stacking corpses for burning, ensuring that none who perished would rise again to join the dead. Tyrion prayed to whatever gods might be listening that they had more time, that the next attack wouldn't come too soon. But he knew, deep in his heart, that time was running short. The great war they'd all whispered about for centuries was at hand, and they were woefully unprepared. So that very night, Tyrion summoned Maester Mullen again, dictating urgent ravens to every corner of Westeros. He wrote with a fervor that bordered on desperation, describing the horrors they had witnessed and imploring the realm to unite. He even swallowed his pride and addressed a personal letter to King Tommen Baratheon, his nephew, though the boy likely believed Tyrion a traitor and a kinslayer. He appealed to reason, to the fact that a threat so dire overshadowed all the petty wars for the Iron Throne. If the wall falls, he wrote, the realm falls. Aid us now, or we all freeze in the long night. Weeks passed, and winter's grip tightened. The wind felt sharper, the snows heavier. Tyrion's watchers ranged farther afield, scouting for signs of another undead host. They encountered the same stark emptiness wherever they went. Abandoned wildling villages, half buried in ice, scattered bodies left to freeze. The next time a horn was sounded thrice, it was from Eastwatch, where a handful of ships had spotted dead men crawling onto the frozen shore. Tyrion dispatched reinforcements, but the walking corpses melted away before they arrived, leaving only broken wreckage and footprints in the snow. Anxiety and exhaustion weighed upon the Night's Watch, but Tyrion refused to let fear cripple them. He oversaw drills, forging alliances with scattered bands of free folk who came south half dead from cold. He listened to their pleas, offering them a chance to pass the wall if they laid down their weapons and helped defend the realm. Some grudgingly agreed, others vanished into the woods. The Black brothers eyed the new arrivals with distrust, but Tyrion reminded them that winter cared nothing for the old hatreds. Then came a miracle of sorts. One gray morning, while Tyrion read over casualty reports, a shout went up from the ramparts. He hurried outside to see banners emerging from the swirling snowfall, banners bearing the dire wolf of House Stark, the flayed man of House Bolton, even the merman of House Manderley. Soldiers, real soldiers, trudging across the bleak landscape to Castle Black. At their head rode a gaunt man with a heavy fur cloak, and beside him more Northmen, their faces set in grim determination. Here were lords who had heeded the call, or at least recognized the peril. Tyrion watched them approach with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The North might have come, but only part of it. He saw no great host. Yet the newcomers brought wagons of grain, fresh horses, and carts of steel-tipped spears. They brought a chance. Tyrion met them in the courtyard, the wind howling like a wolf. The Northmen looked at him with curiosity, some with thinly veiled contempt at seeing a Lannister dwarfed by the furs of command. But their leader, a tall, lean bannerman of the Starks, offered a stiff bow. "My Lord Commander," he said, "we have come to defend the realm." Tyrion nodded, swallowing a swirl of emotion. "Then the Night's Watch welcomes you. We have need of every blade." Over the next hours, men dismounted, provisions were stored, and ranks were organized. The tension between Black brothers and these newcomers was palpable. Old loyalties and grudges lingered. Yet Tyrion strove to ease them into cooperation, hoping they could forge a new alliance under the shadow of the greater threat. It wasn't enough, Tyrion knew. Even if more southern lords marched north, it might be too late. The others were gathering somewhere in the endless white. The free folk still trickled in, telling more gruesome tales of silent storms and armies of whites devouring entire clans. Some spoke of an ice dragon in the deep north. Tyrion didn't know if he should dismiss these stories as superstition, but they all reinforced the same truth. Something ancient and malevolent had awakened, and it hungered for the living. One night, unable to sleep, Tyrion climbed to the top of the wall alone. The cold was ferocious, but he found a measure of peace gazing out over the unbroken expanse of snow. Clouds obscured the moon, casting the land in near-total darkness. His breath curled in the air. He thought of his father, of Jaime and Cersei, of the childhood that had shaped him into a man always mocking, always guarded. How far he had come from the boy who only wanted a place at the family table. Now he stood as the Lord Commander of a band of outcasts, waiting for an enemy that defied comprehension. Yet strangely he felt a sense of purpose he had never known. If the gods had a plan for him, maybe this was it, to stand here at the end of the world, a shield against the night. He chuckled bitterly at the thought, feeling the tears freeze at the corners of his eyes. "You do have a sense of humor, gods," he whispered. "I only hope it doesn't kill us all." Turning, he made his way along the rampart, passing silent sentries with hooded faces. He felt a kinship with them, a brotherhood in the black. They saw him as their commander, but also as one of their own, a man who had chosen to be here. And in that choice, perhaps, was a seed of hope. The next day brought fresh dispatches from the south, rumor of kings and conflict, of wars over the Iron Throne that refused to abate. Tommen was still a boy in King's Landing, controlled by his counselors. The Tyrells had retreated from the capital after a bitter dispute with the remnants of Lannister power. Riverrun was in flames again, some said. The Eyrie remained aloof, distant in its mountain fastness. Tyrion cursed the petty squabbles. Didn't they realize that none of it would matter if the others poured into Westeros? But letters and ravens were not enough to unify a realm that had been broken by too many years of intrigue. Tyrion understood that truth deeply. He had participated in those intrigues himself once, trying to navigate the labyrinth of King's Landing. Now he saw how small all that seemed in the face of true doom. So, he prepared Castle Black as best he could, bolstering its walls, drilling day and night, forging alliances with men from beyond the wall. He took audiences with wildling chieftains, bartering for cooperation against the undead. Some demanded safe passage for their families, some demanded steel. Tyrion negotiated, cajoled, threatened if needed. Bit by bit, a loose coalition took shape around the Black Brothers. Northmen, free folk, even a few wandering cells, words drawn by rumors of the dead. They didn't like each other, many despised Tyrion and each other in equal measure, but the fear of the others overshadowed all. Or so Tyrion prayed. He knew well how quickly distrust could kindle a blaze of betrayal. Months slipped by and the wall was never quiet. Scouts came and went, occasionally disappearing without a trace. The nights grew longer and colder until dawn felt like a fleeting dream. Tyrion spent sleepless hours in his solar, poring over maps, dispatching messages to the Shadow Tower, to Eastwatch, urging them to stay vigilant. He missed the nights of drunken banter and cynicism, the times when he could mock the world's cruelty. Now the cruelty was too vast to mock. The best he could do was try to hold it at bay. At last, the Watchers spotted something on the horizon. Another host approaching the wall, larger than any had yet seen. Not whites, not the dead men, living men, bristling with crude weapons and carrying tall spears. Thousands of them, easily. A tide of free folk, men, women, and children shambling under the ragged banners of various tribes. Leading them, if the Watchers spoke true, was a towering figure, broad of shoulder, crowned with antlers like an ancient god of the weirwoods. Rumor said he was the new king beyond the wall, determined to lead his people to safety no matter the cost. As the first wave of them neared the wall, Tyrion descended to meet them outside the main gate, flanked by a handful of Black Brothers and a representative from the Northern Lords. The air crackled with tension. The free folk parted, revealing their leader, a giant of a man, tall as great John Umber, with a tangled beard of red and gray. His eyes fixed on Tyrion's mismatched gaze, and for a long moment neither spoke. "I'm told you're the Lord Commander," the wildling said at last, in a deep rumble that carried over the wind. Tyrion bowed, just slightly, mindful that bowing too deeply might be read as weakness. "I am," he said. "And you must be the king beyond the wall." The man's lip curved in a grin. "I am Gorn, son of Gorgo, and these are my people." He gestured at the masses behind him. Tyrion saw fear, exhaustion, desperation in their eyes. "We come to pass your wall," Gorn said, "to flee the white shadows that hunt us." Tyrion inhaled, ignoring the swirl of protests from the men behind him. "We've heard tales of these shadows," Tyrion replied, "and we've faced them ourselves. Let there be no illusions, they will come for us here, too, eventually. But it's easier to hold the wall than the open tundra." Gorn frowned. "Will you let us pass, little man? Or will you force a fight?" Tyrion looked beyond him at the ragged throng. Women clutched crying babes, old men hobbled on staff and bone. They had no chance against the others, no matter how fiercely the free folk fought. He sighed. "I'll let you pass, Gorn, and any who come in peace. But you will aid us in the defense of the realm. When the time comes to fight, we fight together. Do we have a bargain?" For a moment, silence stretched taut. Tyrion could sense the tension from both sides, Black Brothers with hands on hilt, wildlings with furrowed brows. Then the giant man extended his arm. Tyrion reached up, gripping the man's forearm in a warrior's clasp. "We have a bargain," Gorn said, his voice firm. Tyrion nodded to the guards at the gate, who parted with some reluctance. Slowly, the free folk began to shuffle inside, a wave of battered humanity seeking refuge at the end of the world. Some Black Brothers watched them with venom in their eyes, but under Tyrion's stern glare, they refrained from violence. Tired families trudged past, carrying all they owned or leading skinny goats and half-frozen dogs. Watching them, Tyrion felt a pang of empathy. These people had been forced from their homes by a terror few truly understood. He wondered what father would say if he could see the dwarf now letting a horde of wildlings pass the ancient boundary of Westeros. But Tywin Lannister was gone, and Tyrion was his own man, Lord Commander of a new era perhaps. And what was the Night's Watch but a refuge for outcasts, for all those cast away by the rest of the realm? Weeks passed in uneasy coexistence. The free folk settled in makeshift camps in the Gift, guarded by Black Brothers and the northern soldiers who tolerated them only out of necessity. Gorn and Tyrion spoke often, forging a wary alliance. The king beyond the wall was no fool, he saw the logic in uniting against the dead. Tyrion respected his frank manner and tried to accommodate his people's basic needs. They were short on supplies, and a harsh winter loomed over them all, but they shared what they could. I'd rather feed them now than fight them later, Tyrion told his senior officers. Or see them rise as whites to tear down the wall from within. Every morning, Tyrion awoke expecting another report of the dead on the move, but for a time there was only eerie silence. Ranging parties found no sign of large undead forces, though they stumbled across scattered pockets of whites, or occasionally an other that vanished into the swirling blizzard. It was as if the enemy was content to let them gather their strength to feed false hope before the final blow. Tyrion dreaded that inevitable strike, unable to predict when it would come. In the meantime, more ravens arrived from the south. A few more lords had agreed to send men or provisions. Word spread that the entire north was beginning to rally, from the houses loyal to Winterfell to the scattered hill clans. The Boltons, it was said, had no desire to face the others alone, for even the Twisted House recognized the threat of annihilation. From the Vale, there were rumors Lord Peter Baelish might ride north with a small force, though many doubted his sincerity. Tyrion remembered Baelish's cunning ways and felt a surge of weariness. The realm might unite too slowly to matter. He tried not to dwell on that. Instead, he focused on forging the best defense possible. In an unprecedented step, he integrated wildling warriors into scouting parties and defensive positions, pairing them with Black brothers. They balked at first, but Tyrion hammered home the necessity. The free folk knew the terrain north of the wall better than anyone. Their knowledge could mean the difference between life and death if the others launched a surprise assault. Put aside your grudges, Tyrion told them. Fight each other later if you must. But if we lose here, there won't be a later. Gradually, the lines between Black Brother and wildling began to blur, especially among those who faced small skirmishes with whites and returned alive. A shared enemy could do wonders to unite bitter foes. Tyrion observed these shifts with cautious optimism. He had no illusions that centuries of enmity would simply evaporate, but at least men were standing together. Perhaps that was all the realm needed in this moment, men standing together, driven by fear or hope to survive. As the nights grew unbearably long, Tyrion received a summons from Gorn asking him to meet at the Free Folk camp in the Gift. Tyrion set out with a small escort, trudging through waist-deep snowdrifts, wind slapping his cheeks raw. They arrived to find the wildlings preparing for a sacred ceremony of sorts. A ring of torches lit a circle in the snow, and around it stood the tribe's elders, their breath frosting in the air. Gorn greeted Tyrion and led him into the circle. There, Tyrion saw something that made his heart lurch, a slab of ice upon which lay a body, half covered in furs. The body of a wildling boy, perhaps 8 or 9, pale and still as death. He died last night, Gorn said quietly. Fever took him. But now we worry. The dead do not always rest as they should. Tyrion's throat tightened. He recalled all the stories, how the dead rose in service of the others, attacking the living. What do you need from me? He asked softly. Gornsvoik. He rumbled with quiet sorrow. We need to burn him. It is our custom too when we fear the whites. But the elders say it must be done with Black brothers present to show our unity and respect for your laws. We want no illusions that we are hiding the dead for foul purposes. Tyrion nodded, feeling a pang of empathy. Of course, he murmured. They stood together in the torchlit circle, wildling and watchman alike, as the elders sang a low, mournful chant in the old tongue. Then, with careful reverence, Gorn bent and touched a torch to the furs. Flames licked hungrily, devouring the boy's body. Tyrion stood by the fire's glow, face grim, feeling the warmth against his numb cheeks. Death was all around them, he realized. But here, in this quiet vigil, there was also a spark of unity, a shared moment of grief. They would face the oncoming night together. Maybe that was enough to give them a chance. When Tyrion returned to Castle Black, he found a raven waiting with news that jolted him more than the night's cold could. His brother, Jaime Lannister, had arrived in Winterfell with a small retinue, proclaiming that the South was in turmoil but that he wished to lend his sword to the defense of the realm. Jaime was rumored to have parted ways with Cersei, who still clung to power in King's Landing. He came alone, or nearly so, accompanied by the faint echoes of a golden lion's pride. Tyrion sat at his desk, rereading the message until his eyes blurred. Jaime here in the north, fighting for a cause bigger than the Lannisters? How the world changed. A week later, Jaime himself arrived at the wall, hair streaked with gray, wearing a heavy fur cloak over his gilded armor. Tyrion waited for him in the courtyard, uncertain of what to say after their long estrangement. Jaime was the brother who had once shown him kindness, the only one in the family who might have loved him. But so much had happened: Tywin's death, the trial, betrayals, and heartbreak. Now they stood face to face in the swirling snow. Jaime's eyes flickered with an emotion Tyrion couldn't name, maybe relief, maybe sorrow. Little brother, he said softly, inclining his head. Tyrion's throat felt tight. "Sir Jaime," he managed, the slightest tremor in his voice. "You've come a long way from King's Landing." A humorless smile tugged at Jaime's lips. "Farther than you know." He looked around the dreary stone walls. "So this is your fortress now?" "I never thought I'd see the day Tyrion Lannister wore the black, let alone commanded it." Tyrion shrugged, trying to muster some wit. "The gods have a twisted sense of humor. Or perhaps I do." Then his voice grew softer. "I'm glad you're here." Jaime nodded. His left hand brushed the pommel of his sword, a phantom gesture since his right hand was gone. "I came because the realm needs every sword, no matter the cost. I tire of petty wars, Tyrion. I've seen too many good men die for nothing but ambition. If what they say is true about the dead rising." He trailed off, his jaw tense. Tyrion placed a hand on his brother's arm, feeling the cold metal beneath the fur. "It is true. I've seen it myself, and we'll see it again soon, I fear." Their eyes locked, shared understanding passing between them. Tyrion saw the lines of remorse in Jaime's face, the faint flicker of hope. Perhaps in this war they could both find a measure of redemption. Over the following days, Jaime acquainted himself with the garrison, advising on battle tactics, sparring with Black brothers, and occasionally exchanging tense words with the Northmen who remembered his history. Tyrion watched from the sidelines, deeply aware of the weight of his own responsibilities. He was Lord Commander, Jaime only a volunteer. But his brother's presence comforted him in an odd way. They might have parted under the worst of circumstances, but now they were reunited under dire necessity, forging a new path. And so the stage was set. The wall braced for what Tyrion knew would be the final confrontation. Word spread that the others were gathering in numbers never seen before, that vast storms followed in their wake, that they had tamed beasts of ice and horror. Rumors circulated of entire wildling clans extinguished overnight, of whites crossing frozen lakes and scaling ice cliffs. Distant reports from Eastwatch said that even the sea itself was freezing along the coast, allowing the dead to walk across. The culminating conflict was inevitable. Tyrion spent each evening in council with Northmen, wildlings, Black brothers, forging the defensive strategy. They would concentrate their forces at Castle Black, which remained the main passage through the wall, but keep watchful eyes on the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch. If the others assaulted multiple castles simultaneously, they would respond with a mobile reserve. They prepared caches of dragon glass weapons from the scant supplies that had arrived from Dragonstone. Every man who could carry a spear or wield a bow was enlisted, and they practiced night and day. Amid the bustle, Tyrion found one moment of quiet reflection. Seated in his solar, a single candle lighting the gloom, he stared at a scrap of parchment. It bore a crude map of the far north, with a symbol marking the lands beyond the Frostfangs. The last known sighting of a massed horde of the dead. Tyrion ran his fingertips over the lines of ink. Here he was, an imp cast out by his noble family, an exile in black, preparing to face an ancient evil that threatened to devour the living world. He thought of Shae, of her betrayal, of the crossbow bolt that ended Tywin Lannister, of the hateful look in Cersei's eyes, and then of Jaime, who had come all this way for a final stand. A shaky laugh escaped him. "Perhaps we are all exiles now," he mused, the living exiled from a world that once felt safe, forced into an alliance of desperation. He blew out the candle, letting darkness fill the room. There was no turning back, no running away. The only path now led straight into the teeth of winter. In the morning, he would continue his vigilance, continue rousing men to defend the realms they scarcely remembered to love. He thought of the vow he had once scorned but now upheld with every breath in his body. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It was more than words. It was the sum of all he was, all he had ever been fated to be. Tyrion Lannister, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, shield against the coming night. As he drifted into a restless sleep, he felt a sliver of warmth in the icy dark, a certainty that for once in his life he stood on the side of something good, something worth dying for, and by the gods, that might just be the noblest legacy a Lannister could leave to the world. The days that followed tested their resolve further. Scouts vanished without a trace. Those who returned came with reports of shifting ice and swirling snow, glimpses of towering figures on undead horses. The tension was unbearable, a silent dread that seeped into the hearts of every defender. Tyrion walked the battlements each dawn, exchanging nods with the archers, reassuring them in his sardonic way that at least they didn't need to worry about forgetting which side the living were on. Anything that smelled worse than their chamber pot was likely an enemy. Some men laughed, though it was a brittle laughter. Night fell earlier and earlier until day was but a few hours of gray light. Then one evening, the horns began to blow, one blast, then two, then three. The dreaded triple call. The others were here. At last, the war for the living had come to the wall in full force. Torches and braziers flickered to life, men scrambled to their stations, and Tyrion donned his thickest furs, heart pounding like a drum. From atop the wall, he stared out into the blackness, seeing shapes on the horizon, a countless mass of white and shadows. The sound of chittering whites echoed on the wind, and if he strained his ears, he swore he could hear a whisper like distant ice cracking, the voice of the others themselves. He descended to the courtyard, meeting Jaime, Gorn, and the assembled captains. "Hold the gate," Tyrion commanded, his voice steady despite the fear coiled in his gut. "Archers, fire at will the moment you see movement. Oil cauldrons on standby. Send word to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, they need to be ready if this is a feint." Men nodded. Some offered salutes, others silent grimaces. Then they scattered to prepare for the onslaught. Tyrion clenched his teeth. No turning back now. They had to hold, or all was lost. Hours passed, and the tension mounted, until finally the undead host surged forward, an endless tide of rotting bodies and skeletal frames. The archers loosed arrows, flaming shafts raining down, illuminating the night. Fires sprang up where oil met dried flesh. The shrieking of the whites was deafening, but still they pressed on, unafraid of pain or death. Among them strode the White Walkers, tall and graceful as pale phantoms, their frost-bladed spears cutting down any who dared approach. The defenders atop the wall lit the huge scorpions, sending bolts tipped with dragaglass into the swirling darkness, occasionally striking another and shattering them in a blast of icy fragments. At the gate, Gorn and his wildlings clashed with the dead in brutal hand-to-hand combat, joined by the Black Brothers, the Northmen, Jaime's retinue. All distinctions of birth or allegiance dissolved in the chaos. Snow turned red with blood and black with ash. Tyrion found himself racing along the ramparts, bellowing orders over the din, ensuring the men didn't waver. The wind howled like a banshee and the entire night seemed alive with terror. Yet, for all their bravery, the defenders were sorely pressed. The whites came in waves, climbing over the burning bodies of their own. Men screamed as they were pulled from the walls and torn apart. Tyrion felt a sick lurch in his stomach every time a comrade fell, knowing they might rise again if not burned. He cursed that they had so few Valyrian steel blades. Jaime wielded one such blade, Oathkeeper, cutting through the whites with savage elegance, though his missing hand slowed him. Each time an other approached, Jaime tried to engage it, but the creatures were swift and the press of battle often prevented a proper duel. Tyrion was no master swordsman, but he carried a dragaglass dagger in his belt, ready for the moment he might need it. More than once, a white lunged at him, only to be cut down by a Black Brother or roasted by a torch-bearing wildling. He thanked them breathlessly each time, forging alliances in the thick of carnage. The night stretched on, an unending nightmare of ice and flame. Then, in the bleak hour before dawn, a horn sounded from somewhere outside the wall, a clarion call that seemed almost triumphant. Tyrion blinked, scanning the darkness, uncertain what new horror or salvation this might herald. Shapes appeared on the eastern flank, mounted riders surging toward the undead from behind. Could it be more enemies? But no, steel clashed against rotted bone, and torchlight glimmered on polished armor. Reinforcements. A host of Northmen, possibly from the Karstarks or Umbers, had circled around to strike the whites from the rear. The undead army found itself caught between two forces. Tyrion let out a ragged cheer, echoed by the men around him. Spurred by that hope, the defenders redoubled their efforts. Oil and pitch rained down, turning the battlefield into a churning sea of flame. The whites sizzled and shrieked. Archers picked off others wherever they could, though it was perilously difficult to strike the swift, ethereal figures. Still, every kill counted, and each destroyed walker caused some of the whites to collapse, the necromantic magic undone. At last, the enemy lines faltered. Whether by the dawn's faint light or by the toll they'd sustained, the others began to withdraw, their skeletal mounts turning north. The remaining whites followed mindlessly, retreating across the blackened field. The defenders let out a resounding roar, part triumph, part profound relief. Tyrion slumped against the rampart, gulping icy air, his body trembling from adrenaline and the savage cold. They had won the night's battle, but at tremendous cost. The courtyard was littered with the dead, and many of the living were maimed or dying. Tyrion forced himself to walk among them, offering what comfort he could. He found Jaime leaning on his sword, blood-spattered and gasping for breath, but alive. Gorn stood beside a pile of slain whites, his chest heaving, tears running down his soot-streaked face for the warriors he had lost. The stench of burnt flesh hung in the air. Grimly, they began the grim work of burning bodies, both white and fallen comrade, to ensure none rose again. Dawn came pale and frigid, illuminating a battlefield of ash. Tyrion summoned what remained of his captains. Each man's face was lined with fatigue and horror. We drove them back, Tyrion said, voice rasping. But they will return, and in greater numbers, I fear. We must hold fast. We must be ready. He looked around at the men, Black brothers, wildlings, Northmen, even a few scattered knights from the south. Never in the history of Westeros had such a strange fellowship been forged. Yet here they were, unified by necessity. This is our duty, Tyrion said. We are the shield that guards the realms of men. Let us do it well. No one cheered. They were too exhausted for false bravado. But Tyrion saw the resolve in their eyes. They understood now, if they hadn't before, that the real war had begun. Tyrion would lead them, a dwarf in black, cunning and battered by fate, but still standing. Over the next days, more parties trickled in from the south, drawn by ravens or by rumor. And though the men of the Night's Watch bled and toiled, their hearts had found a cause worth dying for. Beneath the swirling gray sky, Tyrion walked the ancient walkway atop the wall, thinking of how improbable it was that he, of all men, was entrusted with this burden. But he bore it without complaint. This was his duty now, his family, his life. For all the sins of House Lannister, he vowed to pay this one debt honestly. He would stand until the bitter end, until the dawn came for good or the darkness consumed them all. And perhaps in that stand, Tyrion Lannister would prove that even the smallest, most scorned of men could rise to a greatness beyond measure, forging a legacy not in gold or lies, but in the love and gratitude of a realm he had once thought unworthy. Now, at the end of all things, he recognized that every life was worth saving. Every man was a brother against the night. Thus Tyrion Lannister, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, kept his watch. And though the winds howled and the endless winter loomed, he refused to let his flame of hope be extinguished. He had found purpose on that mighty wall, found a cause that transcended the petty intrigues of lords and ladies. And so he stood guard, small in stature, immense in spirit, his black cloak billowing behind him in the frigid wind, a lonely lion who had found his pride among the crows. And if the gods laughed still, Tyrion at least laughed with them, daring to believe that in this darkest hour, the light of men could prevail. Tyrion Lannister stood upon the wall in the aching blue dimness of pre-dawn, breathing in the cold air that clawed at his throat. Below him, Castle Black slumbered fitfully, those men who could sleep at all scattered across whatever bunks or corners they could find after a night of vigilance. Others dozed upright near brazier fires, crossbows or spears propped close at hand, ready for the next horn blast. There would be another battle, of that Tyrion was certain. The others had withdrawn, but they would return. In his innermost thoughts, he dreaded how they would come back, in greater numbers, with deeper cunning, with those frigid eyes that burned a deeper terror into men's minds than any mortal foe. For all the Watcher's grim humor, talk of heroics or flippant bravado had worn thin. Courage had become endurance, and every day, every night struggle. He exhaled slowly, the frost of his breath lingering in the air. Even in that hushed half-dark, he could see where the scorched earth spread out on the northern side of the wall, charred craters marking the places where the Night's Watch had used wildfire or flaming arrows to destroy wave upon wave of whites. Out there, beyond the line of sight, lay broken spears and bones that would never find rest. He tugged his black cloak tighter. The howling wind tugged back, threatening to snatch it away. Once he might have entertained himself with a biting aside, perhaps about the general misery of the far north, or how it was easier to find a comfortable whore in King's Landing than a warm bed at Castle Black. But those jokes felt stale now. The war was too near, too fierce, for idle banter to serve as a real shield. Instead, Tyrion pressed his lips into a thin line, turned from the parapet, and made his way along the slick walkway of the wall to where his senior officers kept watch. At one end of the rampart, he found Donal, a one-time cell's word from across the narrow sea who'd taken the Black after fleeing a murder charge in Tyrosh. Donal was tall, lean, and had an eye patch over his left eye. He saluted Tyrion with a dragonglass-tipped spear. "All quiet, Lord Commander," Donal said, voice raspy. "No sign of movement from the far ridges." "No sign yet," Tyrion corrected. "But we'll see them soon enough, or they'll find another way to send us nightmares." He paused, looking over Donal's shoulder at the pale horizon. An inkling of sun showed, streaks of watery light bleeding into the sky. "Get some food and rest soon. We can't have our watchers half asleep." Donal nodded, though the lines of exhaustion in his face deepened. "I am, Lord. Just another half-turn on my shift, then I'll pass it on." Tyrion clasped his shoulder gently and continued on. In the yard below, he saw a handful of men stirring from makeshift cots. One brother struggled to light a fire in the frosty breeze, cursing under his breath as sparks refused to catch. Two more fiddled with broken crossbow parts, trying to salvage what they could, stooped over a small workbench near the armory. Their motions felt stiff in the morning chill, as though they were marionettes jerked about by invisible strings. It weighed on Tyrion how battered the watch had become. The men tried their best, but they were short on everything: arrows, food, able-bodied fighters. Even with the recent arrivals, Northmen, wildlings, his brother Jaime's retinue, they were still a patchwork army at best. If the others brought their full force again, Tyrion doubted the wall could endure such punishment more than a few times. A different memory seeped into his mind then of King's Landing during the Battle of the Blackwater. He remembered how he'd stood on the ramparts, commanding the defense, how the wildfire had torn Stannis' fleet asunder, and how for a few moments he had felt like the hero of the realm. Then betrayal and confusion had crushed him, sending him into the blackness of a near-fatal head wound. Here, at the wall, there were no illusions. No matter what cunning he employed, no matter how many stockpiles of wildfire or dragonglass they had, the others were not mortal men. They could retreat and wait, whittling down the living each time. A full, decisive victory would be almost impossible unless, perhaps, the living found some means of rallying a greater force. And that, Tyrion feared, depended on politics as much as on courage. How often had he pinned his hopes on ravens to the south only to receive curt refusals or empty promises? Tyrion was an enemy as relentless as the whites. Sighing, he made his way down the long steps to the courtyard. At the base of the stairs, a figure waited, Maester Mullen, his face creased in the cold. The old man raised a trembling hand. "Lord Commander, we've received new ravens from Winterfell and the Shadow Tower. They arrived before dawn, but I did not wish to disturb your watch." "You should have," Tyrion said, but not harshly. "What do the messages say?" Mullen pressed his lips together. "From Winterfell, Lord Wyman Manderley has pledged an additional 200 men, but the route is difficult and the storms are fierce. He cannot say how long it will take for them to arrive. From the Shadow Tower, they sighted a large group of wildlings traveling east, heading toward Castle Black. They seem unarmed? Possibly refugees." Tyrion grimaced. "More mouths to feed, more terrified souls who have nowhere else to turn. Still, we can't leave them out there to die. We'll arrange shelter in the gift if we must. Let's keep an eye on them, see if they truly come in peace." He drummed his gloved fingers on the hilt of the short sword he wore, a battered old blade with no illusions of elegance. "Anything else from Winterfell? Any response from my brother?" Mullen shook his head. "No, my lord. Ser Jaime departed some days ago, leading a scouting detachment toward Long Lake, hoping to route more supplies north. We've heard nothing new of him." Tyrion tried to bury the flicker of worry. Jaime Lannister was a formidable warrior, even one-handed, but these were not ordinary foes. And the North was never friendly to Lannisters, not even in better times. Tyrion pressed his lips together. "Very well. Thank you, Maester Mullen. See if you can glean more from the Shadow Tower about those refugees. Send the usual caution, greet them, but keep a watchful guard. We cannot afford to be caught unawares if the others slip in among them somehow." "Yes, Lord Commander." Mullen bowed and hurried away, footfalls crunching in the snow. Tyrion lingered in the courtyard, watching a pair of young recruits practice with spears, their breath ragged and visible. The older one lunged, jabbing forward with decent technique. The younger tried to parry and slipped on a patch of ice, sprawling onto his backside. Tyrion winced. At least they were training. In the early days of his command, some of the brothers had refused to see him as an authority, a dwarf who could barely hold his own in the yard. But battle had a way of changing hearts and minds. Tyrion had proven his willingness to stand at the fore when it mattered. He might never be a knight in shining armor, but the men knew he cared about them, about the survival of each of them. He was the one who scoured the old ledgers and found ways to stretch their meager rations, who wrote letters to faraway lords begging for steel and salt. He was the one they teased for being the smallest man with the largest presence. Over time, that had built a quiet respect. If only that respect guaranteed survival. He turned away from the sparring recruits and crossed the yard, stepping around the charred remains of a white cart that had burned days ago. Someone had tried to salvage the wood. A handful of black brothers were sorting the unburned planks from the scorched ones. Tyrion nodded to them, appreciating their industry. Nothing went to waste here, especially not in winter. Approaching the armory, he found Gorn, the king beyond the wall, engaged in low conversation with a cluster of wildling warriors. They all halted when Tyrion approached, eyes watchful. Gorn inclined his head. He was a giant of a man, so tall that Tyrion had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. "Lord Commander," Gorn said in his deep rumble. "We were discussing the next time the dead come. My people are restless." Behind him, one of the wildlings, an older woman with braided gray hair, narrowed her eyes at Tyrion but said nothing. Tyrion took a measured breath. "I expect we won't wait long. The others rarely leave us in peace for more than a few days. But your people have done well, Gorn. We needed your help in the last battle, and we'll need it again. He glanced at the silent ring of wildlings. All of us stand or fall together. The others do not care for the lines on a map. The woman with the gray braids spat into the snow. Lines on a map. Soft kings in the south. Never done us any good. We stand with Gorn because he will lead us to safety or die trying. A noble sentiment, Tyrion said drily. Though safety might be in short supply. We have to keep manning the wall. If enough reinforcements come from the north and the south, perhaps we can hold it. But we can't simply wait for them to batter us again and again. We need to mount scouting operations, keep track of their movements. Gorn grunted. My hunters can scout, but each time we send them north, fewer return. We suspect the dead wander in small packs now, waiting to ambush. The others are cunning. Their leaders aren't mortal, but their whites can be used like hounds on a leash. Tyrion clenched his fists inside his gloves. I know. We must do what we can with what we have. If your people are restless, find ways to keep them busy, felling trees for barricades, carving new arrow shafts. If you need tools, speak to me or the first steward. If the free folk want to survive the next siege, we must be practical. Gorn's dark eyes flickered. He nodded slowly. All right, little man. We'll help. But if we see a chance to slip south, we need your help at the wall, not south, Tyrion cut in, keeping his tone even. We've let a great many of your folk through to the gift, and I won't bar the gates if more want to go. But there is no safety in the south, no matter what rumors you've heard. War rages down there too, and the winter's teeth are not so much kinder. No, the best chance we all have is to hold this line. He paused, studying Gorn's fierce expression. You and I both know what's coming. The others will not vanish. If they sweep through the north unopposed, they'll flood the realms of men. You'd find no haven anywhere. Silence stretched among the wildlings. Then Gorn exhaled heavily. Aye, perhaps that's so. He glanced at the older woman, who gave a reluctant nod. We'll keep to the duties. But mark me, Lord Commander. If your southern lords abandon us, we will find our own path. Tyrion inclined his head. Fair enough. I'd expect nothing less. He offered a faint curve of his mouth. He could not quite call it a smile. Then he turned away. Gorn and his people resumed their hushed talk, presumably about barricades or scouting. Tyrion walked on. The wind picked up, and he shivered, wishing for the 1,000th time he had a cask of spiced wine or brandy to chase the chill from his bones. But every bit of warmth was rationed, every drop of ale or wine saved for wounded men or special bribes. Leadership was compromise. He found himself at the Lord Commander's solar, a small chamber adjacent to the ancient tower that had once served as quarters for Jeor Mormont, and after him several short-lived successors. Tyrion's own possessions were minimal. A few battered books, a single trunk of clothes, a half-burned candle on a rough wooden table. There was no fire in the hearth. Wood was too precious, especially now. Collapsing onto a stool, Tyrion took off his gloves and massaged his numb fingers, letting out a soft groan at the aches in his joints. Gods, he was tired. He thought fleetingly of a featherbed in Lannister, or of the Myrish linens that once adorned his bed in King's Landing. That seemed a life ago. Luxury no longer mattered. He had no illusions about living in comfort. Comfort was for a realm at peace. He stared at his desk, where a leather-bound logbook lay open. Each page contained neat columns detailing supplies, grain, salted fish, hides for tents, workable iron. All of it was diminishing too quickly. If the Free Folk refugees reached them from the Shadow Tower route, Castle Black would have to stretch its rations yet again. The prospect gave Tyrion a wave of dread. Hungry men made poor allies. Then again, starving wildlings made dangerous enemies. Balancing the ledger was more complicated than it had ever been at King's Landing. At least there, as master of coin, Tyrion could conjure illusions of solvency through loans or cunning deals. Here, illusions did not fill bellies or keep limbs from freezing. A knock sounded at the door. Tyrion straightened, pushing the ledgers aside. "Enter," he called. The door opened to reveal Dolorous Ed, his long face seeming more morose than usual. Ed removed his hood. "Lord Commander, got an urgent bit of news. A ranger party returned, says they spotted something. They're down in the common hall warming themselves. Said they need to speak to you." Tyrion nodded, rising with a grunt. "Thank you, Ed. Let's go." Ed led him out into the yard again and down a short set of steps into what passed for the common hall, really just a large stone chamber with trestle tables, a perpetually smoking fireplace, and a smell of old stew. The hall was half empty at this hour, with only a few men huddled near the fire or slurping at bowls. In one corner, 3 rangers still wore their cloaks dusted with snow, their faces drawn. Tyrion recognized 2 of them as veterans, Rory and Hagen, both with wildling blood in their veins but loyal to the watch. The third was Jaren, a younger recruit from the Crownlands who never quite lost his look of wide-eyed wonder at the savage north. They rose when Tyrion approached, though one clutched his side in pain. Tyrion gestured for them to sit. "At ease, men? You wanted to speak with me?" Rory glanced at Hagen, then cleared his throat. "My lord, we rode out 2 days ago, looking for sign of that mass of whites rumored north of the Then Valley. We followed old tracks, found remains of a wildling camp, burned tents, bodies. Looked like they'd been dead a while. But that's not the real news." Tyrion steeled himself. "Go on." Hagen spat into the rushes, his eyes flicking around the dim hall. "Tracks, Lord Commander. Dozens of fresh ones, maybe more. They circled around the camp. We followed them through a pass. And we found a body. A man. Looked like a knight from the south, clad in battered plate. One hand missing. He'd been, well, torn up something fierce. Could barely recognize him, but the gold hair, eh?" Tyrion's stomach twisted. He knew exactly whom they meant. "My brother," he said, voice barely a whisper. "Jaime Lannister." He tried to keep his composure. "You're sure?" Rory looked pained. "We can't be certain, my lord, but the hair, the missing hand, the lion's sigil on the half-shredded cloak. Aye, we think it was Ser Jaime. There wasn't much left. Wolves might have gotten to the corpse or worse. We had to run from White soon after. We couldn't bring him back." Pain shot through Tyrion's chest, and for a moment he could not speak. Jaime was the one family member who had ever cared for him, who had tried, in his flawed way, to protect him. They had parted on uneasy terms so many times only to find a fragile reconciliation here at the end of the world. And now gone? Torn apart in the wilderness, lost to whites or wolves. Tyrion felt his vision blur as tears threatened, but he blinked them away. These men needed him to stay strong. "I see," he managed finally, his voice low. "Thank you for telling me." He swallowed, tasting bile. "What of the other knights who rode with him? Any sign?" Hagen shook his head. "No bodies that we saw, but the place was a mess. Tracks everywhere. We had to flee. There was no time for a thorough search. We only know that we saw a dead man who looked like your brother." Tyrion's jaw clenched. He forced himself to ask the next question. "Did you see anything to suggest he might have risen as a white?" The thought twisted a knife in his gut. The idea of Jaime returning as a mindless corpse was almost too terrible to countenance. But Tyrion had to know. Rory's face went bleak. "No, my lord. We found him still. But we had to burn what we could of the corpse, to keep it from rising. We said the words, set it aflame." He hesitated. "It wasn't a proper pyre, but we did what we could." A tremor passed through Tyrion, gratitude mixing with profound sorrow. "Then you did him a kindness," he whispered. "Thank you." The rangers nodded, heads bowed. Tyrion let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jaime, at least, would not join the ranks of the dead. He was gone, truly gone. The finality of it settled over Tyrion like a leaden cloak. He closed his eyes for a moment. Memories of Jaime flooded his mind. Childhood moments when Jaime was the only one who didn't call him imp with contempt. The half-smile Jaime wore when teasing him about brothels. The sorrow in Jaime's gaze when they reunited here at the wall. All of that ended in a remote pass in the freezing cold. He opened his eyes again, meeting the rangers' uneasy stares. "Well done, men. You did your duty. Go find Mullen. Give him every detail. Let him record the location. If any of Jaime's companions remain alive, we owe it to them to search in that area. But for now, rest." They saluted. Tyrion murmured thanks, then turned on his heel, exiting the hall before the hot press of grief could fully overwhelm him. Dolorous Ed lingered by the threshold, his long face pulled down. "I'm sorry, Lord Commander," Ed said softly. "Ser Jaime was a good man." Tyrion nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "He was," he said, voice hoarse. Excuse me, Ed. I need a moment." He stepped out into the courtyard. The cold slapped him, and he welcomed it. Perhaps it could freeze the anguish before it became unbearable. Snow swirled in the wind, the color of bone ash. Tyrion stared at the whiteness, letting it fill his vision. His chest felt tight. Tears threatened again, but he fought them back. What good would tears do? The living needed him, and Jaime's death needed to matter somehow. He found his feet carrying him toward the small sept that stood at the corner of Castle Black, a cramped, weather-beaten structure with a single cracked window. Long ago it had served devout black brothers, but it stood mostly empty now. Tyrion wasn't sure why he went there. He had never been a pious man, and he doubted the gods had anything left to offer. Perhaps he just wanted some solitude. Inside, the place smelled of old dust and candle wax. A single septon stool stood before an altar bearing 7 chipped icons. The father, the mother, the warrior, the smith, the maiden, the crone, and the stranger. Snow had drifted in through a gap in the roof, forming a small pile near one wall. Tyrion rubbed his arms against the chill. He stared at the icons, remembering the cynicism with which he'd once viewed them all. Now he wondered if the stranger himself walked in the flesh, in the shape of the others, taking souls by the thousands. He swallowed hard. "Jaime," he whispered, "you were the best of them in your own twisted way. I should have told you that more often." The emptiness of the sept gave no answer. He flicked his gaze from one icon to the next. "Did you watch, gods? Did you see his end, out in that frozen wasteland? He was a proud man. Proud men don't deserve to die whimpering in the snow. If you had any mercy, you would have spared him that." His words faded into silence. The icons stared back, unchanging, unfeeling. Tyrion let out a tremulous breath. He felt anger stir in his chest, anger at the gods' indifference, at the realm's folly, at the unstoppable encroachment of the dead. "If there's any justice in this world," he said roughly, "I'll make certain the others are turned back. I'll do it in Jaime's memory, if no other reason." He sank onto the stool, letting his head fall into his hands. For a long time he remained there, wrestling with grief. The cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't move. Silent tears came and went. At last he forced himself to rise. Duty beckoned. He left the sept, stepping once more into the swirling snow of the courtyard. Men bustled around him, black brothers, free folk, Northmen, each with tasks that seemed mundane but were woven into the greater tapestry of survival. Tyrion drew a long breath and steeled himself. Lord Commander. He had to be that man, even with heartbreak gnawing at him. He spotted Gorn again, overseeing a group of wildlings who were sharpening spears around a hastily built fire. Tyrion approached. "Gorn," he said, voice firm, "I've just received news my brother may have been killed beyond the wall." He said it plainly, refusing to hide behind euphemisms. He was scouting for supplies or survivors, and he never made it back. Gorn's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, little man," he said quietly. "We free folk didn't always have kind words for the Kingslayer, but he fought well the last time the dead came. He died with steel in his hand, I'm sure." Tyrion didn't want to imagine the details. He murmured. "He must have." He cleared his throat. "Which brings me to my point. We need to strengthen our scouting operations, but I'll not send men blindly to their deaths. Is there a route, some hidden pass or vantage, that might let us gather information on the others without stumbling into them headlong?" Gorn stroked his beard. "There's an old path near the Frostfangs, used mostly by goat herders in days past. Dangerous, but if your rangers are hardy, they might slip through unseen. Or they might freeze. But if it's information you want—" "I do," Tyrion said. "We need to see how large their gatherings are, whether they're summoning more whites. Also, the Shadow Tower reported a group of free folk heading this way. I want to confirm if they're truly refugees. If you can spare a few of your best trackers, men or women who know that region, I'll pair them with some black brothers. They won't engage, only observe." Gorn paused, exchanging glances with his people. "I'll find you 2 or 3. They'll do it for me. But mind you, Dwarfling, if they find a real host of the dead, it may be that no vantage or pass will save them." "I know the risk," Tyrion said. But we cannot keep fighting blind. Let me know which of your folk will go and have them meet me in the common hall at dusk. We'll select a few rangers to join them." Gorn nodded, and Tyrion managed a tight smile of thanks before turning away. He spent the next hours in a blur of duties, checking on the wounded in the infirmary, half of whom had injuries that would have doomed them without the meager healing supplies they had. Inspecting the armory where the master-at-arms was cursing the shortage of arrow shafts. Reviewing the meager stores of dragaglass kept under lock in a stone cell. Everything was scarce, everything stretched. And the cold pressed in, unrelenting. Despite the day's somber beginning, Tyrion forced himself to keep moving. Men needed to see that he was present, that he didn't retreat into gloom or despair. At times, he paused to offer a word of encouragement or a wry remark that drew a half-chuckle from a weary brother. A small gesture, but it reminded them that they were still living men, not automatons waiting to be slaughtered. When dusk fell, the common hall filled with new arrivals, groups of free folk who had been out gathering wood or scouting, black brothers returning from routine patrols, a handful of Northmen who had formed a rotating guard at the wall. The air buzzed with talk. The smell of stew, thin and watery but hot, drifted through the hall. Tyrion stood near the central table, a battered pine structure that served as a place for announcements, meager fia. STS or councils. Gorn arrived with 3 of his hunters, a wiry man named Sig, a broad-shouldered woman named Mara, and a younger lad with sharp eyes called Byrne. Tyrion appraised them quickly. They looked capable, dressed in heavy furs, their weapons well-maintained. He was joined by 4 black brothers, Pate, Maller, Tuffle, and Kell. None were green recruits, though Tuffle had been pressed into the watch for theft and Kell was a former Sellsword. They stood at awkward attention, half expecting a formal speech. Tyrion cleared his throat. "You 7 will form a scouting party heading out before dawn tomorrow. You'll skirt north, making for that goat-herders pass Gorn mentioned. 2 tasks. 1. Locate any large concentration of whites or others if you can do so safely, and determine their numbers. 2. Locate the group of free folk rumored to be traveling east toward Castle Black. If you find them, ascertain their intentions and guide them here if they're friendly. If not, do what you must to keep them from alerting the others about our defenses." "Understood." They all nodded. Mara spat on the floor. "Understood, Lord Commander. Let's just hope we don't freeze our cocks and tits off." A few of her companions snorted. Tyrion raised a brow but didn't chastise her. The free folk had their ways. "All right, get your rest, gather supplies. Only pack what you need, travel light. We can't risk big encampments that draw attention." Tyrion produced a small parchment with sketches of the terrain gleaned from old maps and Gorn's advice. "A rough guide. Sig, you have the best knowledge of the area, so you'll lead. Pate, you outrank the other black brothers by a hair, so you're second. Make sure you keep watch at all times, day and night. If you see any sign of the others, do not engage. We need you back alive. Gods be with you." They mumbled agreements and saluted or nodded depending on whether they were black brothers or wildlings. Tyrion let out a slow breath as they scattered, each to their own preparations. He had just dispatched 7 more lives into the uncertain darkness. The weight of it pressed on him, but he squared his shoulders and looked around the hall. Men sat at the long tables, passing around bread and stew. In a corner, a pair of northern soldiers tried to teach a free folk warrior a rowdy drinking song. Another man sharpened his axe in grim silence. Such scenes had become so commonplace that Tyrion could almost forget they were at the edge of a cosmic threat. Almost. He made his way to the barrel of what passed for ale, thin, sour stuff that had been brewed with questionable grains in the gift. He poured a small portion into a chipped wooden cup. He sniffed it, made a face, and sipped. It tasted like rancid water, but at least it was bitter enough to jolt his tongue. He imagined a cask of Arbor Gold or a fine Dornish red. Another time, another life. Then he turned, leaning against the barrel, and let his gaze drift across the hall. A hush fell. Gorn stood at the head of one table, raising his arms. "Hear me, crows and free folk alike," he called out in a booming voice. Conversations died, eyes turning. "We lost more of our own today in a skirmish near Eastwatch. My cousin Tarl and my friend Skessa. Cut down by dead men who do not stop. We burn their bodies now so they don't rise. And tomorrow we keep fighting for the living." A rumble of agreement passed through the wildlings. A few black brothers nodded solemnly. Tyrion watched as Gorn's expression hardened. "We come from different worlds, but those worlds are ashes if we fail. Remember that tonight. Eat, drink what little we have, and stand guard. We'll see if the dawn finds us alive." A bitter statement of camaraderie, Tyrion thought. But it was camaraderie nonetheless. Men resumed their talk in hushed voices, the tension heavier than before. Tyrion finished his sour ale, placed the cup aside, and slipped from the hall, leaving men to whatever solace they could find. Outside, snow whipped across the courtyard in small eddies, lit by flickering torches. The wind had a cruel bite. Tyrion hunched into his cloak. He thought of returning to his solar, but he knew he would find no comfort there. Instead, he climbed the steps to the top of the wall once more, seeking a vantage on the night. Maybe if the air was clear, he would see torchlight from Eastwatch or the Shadow Tower or detect any sign of movement on the horizon. He reached the top, finding Donal again, still at his post. "Stubborn man," Tyrion murmured. "Didn't you say you'd rest by midday?" Donal shrugged, a rueful smile on his scarred face. "I tried. Bad dreams. Easier to be up here, keeping watch." Tyrion nodded. "I understand. Dreamless sleep is a luxury we can rarely afford." He peered over the ramparts. Below lay a vast expanse of white, faintly illuminated by moonlight. The sky was overcast but not so thick as to plunge them into total blackness. The shapes of distant hills and ridges loomed like ghosts. He closed his eyes, letting the wind cut across his face. Jaime was gone. Tyrion had lost the last tether to the family he once had. Part of him wanted to weep, to rage at the injustice of it, but a numb resolve kept that storm at bay. He thought instead of the words he'd spoken to the icons in the sept, he would do his damnedest to defend the living, for Jaime's sake if nothing else. It was the only purpose left to him in this world. When at last he returned to his solar, he found a single letter waiting on his desk, sealed with a simple blob of wax and bearing no sigil. Sighing, Tyrion broke the seal. The handwriting was unfamiliar, large and uneven. "Lord Commander, we march north from the Dread Fort with 300 men. My lord demands safe passage through the last river crossing. We come to fight the dead. If you stand in our way, you'll regret it. If you let us join, we'll do our part." No signature, but Tyrion recognized the mention of the Dreadfort House Bolton's seat. So the Boltons were sending men? Were they genuine in their desire to join the defense? Or was this some twisted ploy? Ramsay Bolton was rumored to be as cruel and cunning as his father Roose once was. But in the face of the others, perhaps even Ramsay had seen the writing on the wall. Tyrion set the letter aside with a sardonic twist of his lips. If the Boltons truly marched, that meant more soldiers, but also more tension with the other northern houses. The Manderleys despised the Boltons, as did the remnants of the Starks' loyal bannermen. Holding that alliance together would be like juggling wildfire. Still, the living needed every blade. Tyrion could not turn them away. He wrote a terse reply, bidding them proceed to the gift, where watchers from the Night's Watch would meet them and guide them to Castle Black. He would warn those watchers to keep their eyes open. Bolton men could be as treacherous as any. By the time he finished drafting the letter, the candle on his desk guttered, plunging the room into murky darkness. Tyrion rubbed his eyes. No rest for the weary. Outside, the wind howled like a maddened beast. He realized he was shivering in his seat. Wrapping his cloak tighter, he sank onto his narrow cot. Sleep took him in fits, nightmares prowling at the edges of his mind. He dreamed of Jaime, face pale in the snow, eyes wide in betrayal, reaching out with a skeletal hand. He dreamed of Cersei, a mocking laugh on her lips as the red keep burned. He dreamed of the others striding across a frozen sea, their voices crackling like broken ice. At some point he woke, panting, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cold. He stared at the dark ceiling, feeling unmoored from time. Dawn came eventually, or something like dawn, a faint gray light that signaled the shift of day. Tyrion roused himself, feeling as if he hadn't slept at all, and discovered that the scouting party had already departed. Good. They might slip away unnoticed by the undead. He inhaled the thin, frigid air and prepared himself for another day in the crucible. The hours blurred into the routine of command. Writing to Eastwatch about the rumored free folk, conferring with the master-at-arms about forging more crude arrowheads, checking on the handful of loyal ravens in the rookery, which needed constant feeding to keep them from starving. By midday, a new wave of wildling refugees arrived. Half-frozen children, grim-faced warriors with chipped blades. Tyrion oversaw the admission, verifying that Gorne's lieutenants handled it without incident. Each time the gates opened, Tyrion felt a stab of worry. What if the others used the refugees as cover for an attack? But no horns blasted, No whites emerged from the swirling snow. Not yet. The day wore on. By the time shadows lengthened, Tyrion found himself pacing on the ramparts, scanning the horizon for any sign of the scouts. Of course, it was far too soon for their return, but he couldn't quell his worry. Had they stumbled upon the main host of the others, or that rumored band of free folk? He imagined a tangle of possibilities. Too many ended with the Watchers never returning. As the sky darkened toward a pale blue dusk, Tyrion heard a commotion in the yard. Shouts, hurried footsteps. He rushed down to find a knot of men near the gate. In their midst stood two strangers, panting, cloaked in heavy furs dusted with snow. They looked exhausted, their breaths coming in ragged bursts. One was a lanky wildling, the other wore the black garb of a Night's Watch deserter, at least that's what it seemed from the battered scraps of his uniform. They were talking at once, voices competing. Tyrion's presence cut through the noise as he stepped forward, raising a hand for silence. "Who are you? Speak one at a time." The wildling spoke first, words tumbling out in a rush. "We came from a camp near Craster's Keep, or what's left of it. The dead swarmed us. Some of us ran south, ended up crossing paths with this Black Crow. We saw something bad. We have to warn you." Tyrion's brow furrowed. "Warn me of what?" The Night's Watch man, he couldn't have been older than 20, took over, voice trembling. "The dead are massing in the forest. An army, thousands. White Walkers in the midst. We barely escaped. We saw them tear apart a village. They had beasts with them, big wolves that weren't wolves, all bones and black eyes." He paused to gulp air. "They're marching this way." Tyrion felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "When did you see them?" "2 nights past. They travel slowly, but they don't rest. They're heading for the wall. They'll be here soon, a matter of days, maybe less." Silence fell in the yard, men exchanging horrified glances. Tyrion forced himself to think. They'd always known another large assault might come. Here was confirmation from 2 separate sources, though he had no time to verify the details. Is there any sign they might split their forces, attack Eastwatch or the Shadow Tower as well? The wildling shrugged helplessly. "Could be. We only saw the vanguard. It was huge. So many whites." His voice cracked. "They move in near silence, except for the wind and that sound of cracking ice." Tyrion nodded grimly. "Right? Let's get you both inside, fed, warmed. If you're lying, we'll find out soon enough. If you're telling the truth, the entire realm is in peril." He turned to Dolores Ed, who hovered nearby. "Get them cloaks and hot stew, let Maester Mullen speak with them. Then put them in a guarded dormitory for now." Ed saluted, ushering the men away. Tyrion stood there, his breath steaming, a feeling of grim inevitability settling over him. Another horde of the undead. He thought of the last assault, how close they had come to being overwhelmed. Their ranks had thinned since then, and they hadn't received near enough reinforcements to offset that. Another major battle would test them to the brink. He turned to the men gathered around. Gorn was there, arms crossed, eyes smoldering. So were a handful of Black brothers and northern soldiers. Tyrion's voice rang out calm but urgent. "We have our warning. Ready the defenses. Double the watch atop the wall tonight. Bring all available weapons to the armory. Check the stock of wildfire. I want every man, woman, or child capable of carrying a weapon to be armed and assigned a station. That includes any free folk who can hold a spear." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the Northmen bristled at the notion of arming wildlings, but no one dared challenge Tyrion outright. They had seen enough of the last battle to know the price of infighting. "Send ravens to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower," Tyrion continued. "Alert them that the next major assault may be imminent. Ask them to spare what men they can, or we'll be lost. Gorn, get your people ready. I want a lookout system established. If any portion of the other's army tries to circle wide, we need early notice." Gorn nodded once. Tyrion's eyes flicked over the Watchers. "We may not have days. They might be upon us by tomorrow night. Keep the gates locked except for short intervals to allow our own scouts back in if they return in time. And for the gods' sake, make sure the fires are set and the pitch is ready. If we let the whites swarm the gate, we die." With that, the yard erupted in motion, men scattering to fulfill their orders. Tyrion stood in the center of the storm, alone for a moment, the swirl of snow around him mirroring the dread in his chest. Jaime was gone. The others were coming in overwhelming force. This was the darkest hour of the realm. And he was the Lord Commander, the man expected to hold the line. He set his jaw, reminding himself of the vow, "I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men." The old words carried a new weight. If he must die, let it be in defense of the living, a final gift to a world that had never truly loved him. His final words to the men before they dispersed had been about the pitch and the gates. Now Tyrion forced himself to remain focused on details. That was how he had always survived: mind the details, keep track of the small levers of power. But this war might not be won by cunning alone. It might require sacrifice beyond measure. He ascended the steps of the wall again, ignoring the protesting ache in his legs. At the top, he scanned the horizon. Nothing yet. The sky glowed with the last traces of sunset, blood-red and ominous. Across that crimson backdrop, the shadows of distant hills stood out like ragged teeth. It was beautiful in a savage way, but it made Tyrion's gut clench. This land was on the brink of apocalypse. He heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw one of the new northern arrivals. Ethan Glover, sworn to House Stark. Approach. Glover's face was pale but resolute. "Lord Commander," he said quietly, "I've stationed my men along the parapets. Do you truly think it will come so soon?" Tyrion sighed. "I hope not, but we have to assume the worst. If they march without rest, they could close the distance quickly." Glover nodded, lips thin. "If the Boltons arrive with 300 men, that might help. Or bring more discord," Tyrion muttered. "But we'll take what we can get." He paused, looking out again. "Have your men keep torches and bows close at hand. Remember, aim for the walkers if you see them. Destroying a walker can undo many whites at once. Dragonglass is best, Valyrian steel if you have it, but we only have so much. Fire will slow the whites, but not always stop them. And if they breach the gate, we rely on the men behind the walls to stand firm." Glover bowed his head. "We will stand, my lord. The North remembers." Then he stepped away, leaving Tyrion with that old northern phrase echoing in his mind. The North remembers what? The betrayals of House Bolton, the horrors unleashed by the War of the Five Kings, the cruelty inflicted on House Stark. Now all of that seemed petty next to the threat of the others. Darkness settled, and Castle Black buzzed with preparation. Fires dotted the walkway atop the wall, where archers tested the tension of bowstrings. Below, men carried buckets of oil to the gate. Some hammered makeshift wooden stakes. Others prayed to any gods who would listen. Tyrion supervised as best he could. Now and then, a man would approach him, seeking reassurance. He offered what words he had, though inwardly he felt as uncertain as any. Midnight approached, time measured only by the faint glow of the moon behind shifting clouds. Tyrion tried to rest, but he couldn't. Instead, he stood again atop the wall, scanning the emptiness. He caught sight of Gorn, far down the line, speaking with wildling lookouts. On another section, Dolorous Ed paced, crossbow in hand. The cold sank its claws into Tyrion's flesh. Suddenly, a man shouted. Then another. Tyrion's head snapped around. In the far distance, on the northern horizon, faint flickers danced like ghostly torches in the gloom. Another shout. "Lights! Lights north!" Men scrambled, pressing closer to the edge, straining to see. Tyrion felt his heart pound. Could it be the others? Their icy magic sometimes manifested as eerie glows, but this looked more like flames, orange and red, against the black sky. A raging fire? Then shapes appeared, tiny at this distance, but definitely shapes moving southward. A moment later, a horn blast cut through the night. Once, twice, then a pause. Tyrion waited, breath tight. The third blast never came. Instead, a single horn note sounded again, wobbly as if from a winded ranger. Twice more. Tyrion's gut twisted. 2 blasts was the signal for wildlings. But this was no ordinary group. "Open the gates," came a shout from below. "It's the scouts returning. They're being chased." Tyrion's blood went cold. He ran for the winch that lowered the rickety platform, ignoring the protests of men who told him to wait. He wanted to see for himself. The platform shuddered its way down the face of the wall. Even from above, Tyrion could see a knot of figures racing across the snowy field, some on foot, some staggering, with torches bobbing. Behind them, in the darkness, shapes lunged and writhed, unholy silhouettes. The gates groaned open, Black Brothers forming a protective line. Archers on the ramparts loosed flaming arrows, trying to deter the pursuers. Tyrion's heart hammered. If that was the scouting party, they must have run afoul of the whites. But how many had survived? The platform jolted to a stop near ground level. Tyrion leapt off, nearly stumbling. The yard was a frenzy of activity, men lighting torches, gathering weapons. On the other side of the gate, he could see the shape of Sig or Pate, he couldn't tell in the confusion, dragging a wounded companion. A wildling woman, Mara, perhaps, hurled a spear behind her at an unseen foe. They sprinted through the parted gate, collapsing in the yard. Immediately, Black brothers slammed the gate shut, bracing it with heavy timbers. Screeches echoed from beyond. Tyrion heard the thud of bodies hitting the reinforced wood. A jolt of terror coursed through him. Whites! The assault had begun sooner than they'd hoped. Fire! Someone yelled. A wave of oil was dumped from the murder holes above the gate, followed by torches. A great whoosh sounded and flames roared up outside. The shrieks rose in pitch, then faded as the whites retreated from the conflagration. Tyrion smelled burnt hair and rotted flesh. In the yard, the battered scouts gasped for breath. Mara was indeed among them, her face streaked with blood. She coughed, struggling to stand. Tyrion rushed forward, kneeling beside Pate, who clutched a savage wound in his side. What happened? Ty! Ryan demanded. Saw them, an army, Pate rasped. So many whites, we tried to circle around, then they found us. Others, so close. He coughed, blood flecking his lips. We lost Tuffle and Kel. Sig took an arrow of ice to the chest, didn't survive. Tyrion looked around, seeing Byrne, the young wildling, sobbing in a corner, arms wrapped around himself. Mara pressed a hand to a wound on her shoulder. Out of the 7 who'd gone, only 4 had returned, and 2 of those looked grievously injured. You made it back, Tyrion said, voice tight. That's something. Did you see how far behind the rest of them are? They're close, Mara said, teeth chattering. We only just outran their outriders. The main host can't be more than a day behind. They have giant whites, the size of small mountains. We saw them smashing through the forest. Tyrion's mind raced. Giants. In the last battle, they'd had to contend with only a few white giants, which were terrifying enough. A whole host of them? He swallowed hard. You did well to warn us. Let's get you to Maester Mullen. He waved over a pair of men to help them up. Soot and smoke rose from the gate, where the oil fire burned, crackling in the night. Tyrion's gut churned. This was it. There would be no more waiting, no more respite. The great war for the living had truly come. He clenched his fists, ignoring the trembling in his arms. All right, he shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. Everyone, to your posts. Archers, keep watch from the ramparts. Rangers, ready at the tunnels and gates. Wildfire teams, stand by. Torches flared as men rushed to comply. Tyrion made his way to the steps leading back to the top of the wall. He paused only to help a limping black brother to his feet. When he reached the crest, the scene outside was grimly visible in the flicker of burning oil, scattered whites, some crawling, others half on fire, clawing at the ground. Arrows rained down, finishing them off. Farther in the distance, the darkness was vast and impenetrable, but Tyrion thought he caught a flicker of movement, an unending legion of the dead, waiting. Gorn appeared beside him, breath fogging in the cold. So it begins. We'll see dawn soon enough, whether it's our dawn or theirs. Tyrion glanced at the wildling leader. Have your men ready for a full-scale attack by morning. That gate was only a fraction of their vanguard from the sound of it. Gorn nodded, face grim. We've axes and spears, a few bows. We'll fight. Somewhere below, an agonized scream rent the air, one of the wounded scouts succumbing to his injuries, or worse. Tyrion forced himself not to flinch. He had to maintain the facade of steadiness. We'll give them a fight they'll not forget, he said, though the bravado felt hollow. This was an enemy that knew no fear, no pain. He turned his gaze again to the horizon. The night was endless, the cold merciless, but the men of Castle Black stood ready as best they could. As the long hours crawled by, the watchers with keenest eyes reported faint shapes drifting at the edges of vision as though the whites tested the boundaries. Flaming arrows occasionally soared, hissing into the darkness. Now and then a white screeched or a shadow collapsed. But no major surge arrived that night. Tyrion suspected the others were biding their time, waiting for the break of day or some other fell moment to unleash their full might. They had the luxury of patience. The men on the wall shivered, stamping their feet, trying to keep warm. Tyrion walked among them, offering a quiet word here, a nod there. He thought of Jaime once more, how his brother had faced dire battles with a swift sword hand back when he had too. Would Jaime have stood here on the wall, even in that diminished state, with pride and defiance, had he survived? Likely so. In that memory, Tyrion found a small kernel of strength. Shortly before dawn, a horn blast sounded from the western rampart. Men rushed to see. 1, 2 blasts. Wildlings. The watchers peered intently. Through the faint pre-dawn glow, they saw a knot of figures trudging across the snow. far fewer than in the rumor that had preceded them. Some carried ragged banners that might have once been colorful. The watchers atop the wall lit torches or raised lanterns, hoping to discern more. Tyrion and Gorn hurried to that section, panting. "A band of free folk," someone called. "Looks like a couple dozen at most." "Open the gate or let them freeze," another asked. Tyrion exchanged a look with Gorn. "They might bring valuable news," Tyrion said. "But we can't be reckless." Gorn nodded. "I'll go meet them with a few of my people. Let's keep the gate cracked, no more. Have archers ready if they try something." So it was done. Gorn and a squad of wildlings plus a few black brothers stepped beyond the gate, bristling with weapons. Tyrion watched from above. The new arrivals stumbled forward, clearly exhausted, many limping or half-frozen. Gorn conferred with them, their voices too low to carry. Then he waved, signaling they were friendly, and men began ushering the newcomers inside. The gate slammed shut behind them. Moments later, Gorn returned to the yard with a half-frozen free folk woman who looked more like a corpse than a living soul. "Found them wandering," he told Tyrion. "The rest of their group was lost to whites in the forest. They barely escaped." The woman shivered violently, her cheeks blue with cold. "They're right behind us," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not far. We heard them, the dead, rustling through the trees. We kept moving until we saw the lights of the wall. Please let us stay." Tyrion nodded. "Of course. You're safe now. As safe as any of us." He signaled for Mullen or any available healers to tend to her. The free folk behind her, men, women, even a pair of young children, blinked around at Castle Black with dazed relief. They had found refuge at the end of the world, though refuge might be a short-lived notion. An ashen gloom settled over the courtyard. Morning was there, but the sun didn't show its face. It was the sort of day that felt like a perpetual twilight. Tyrion knew the enemy might strike at any hour. He forced himself to quell the panic in his gut. They had to hold. There was nowhere else to go. He ascended the wall again, rallying the men for what would surely come. Archers lined the parapets, casks of arrows at their feet. Runners checked the oil cauldrons. On the ground below, warriors waited in defensive lines. Some had makeshift shields made from scrapwood. Others bore ancient steel, rusted but serviceable. The wildlings mingled with Northmen, black brothers, and stragglers from across the realm. Tyrion marveled at the ragged tapestry of humanity. If only the realm had been united sooner rather than shredding itself in war after war, maybe they'd have stood a better chance. Near midday, a low moaning wind swept in from the north. The watchers gripped the icy stone. Then they saw it, a pall of white and gray on the horizon, an unnatural blizzard swirling. Within that storm, faint shapes moved, thousands upon thousands, advancing in eerie unison. No horns sounded from the dead. No banners flew. Only the silent march of an army that was no longer alive. "Gods help us," someone muttered. Tyrion swallowed, feeling his pulse hammer. He turned to the nearest cluster of archers. "Steady. Wait until they're in range. Don't waste arrows." Down below, horns blared, one blast for watchers to man the defenses, another to ready the fire crews. Tyrion imagined the confusion among the new arrivals, children cowering, the wounded huddled together. But he could only focus on the immediate crisis. Thousands of whites, maybe tens of thousands, a wave of unstoppable cold. Among them, he thought he glimpsed towering silhouettes, giant whites, as Mara had said. And in the swirling storm overhead, shapes that might be winged? He couldn't be sure, but terror coiled in his belly. He raised a hand. "Archers. Knock." They obeyed, pulling arrow after arrow from the casks, lighting them from braziers. The fletching caught the flames, dancing orange. Tyrion waited, breath tight. The silent host drew closer, the swirling snow intensifying, as if the others commanded the very weather. Then, in a sudden swirl of movement, the front rank of whites charged. "Loose!" Tyrion shouted, and 1,000 arrows streaked into the storm. Some found their marks, igniting whites that collapsed. But the undead did not feel pain, they clambered over their fallen. Another volley, then another. The watchers poured fire down. Whites screeched as flames consumed them, but more replaced them. Tyrion could hear the thunder of the horde slamming into the base of the wall, scrabbling at the ice with inhuman determination. From his vantage, he saw massive shapes smashing into an old outbuilding near the western corner. The ground teams had prepared a ring of trenches and stakes around that side, and the whites impaled themselves blindly, piling up in grisly heaps. Fire rained from above, turning it into a blazing ring of death. But still they came on, unstoppable in their numbers. Then the giant whites lumbered into view, each step sending tremors through the earth. One swung a crude, gargantuan club of splintered timber, crashing it into the stakes, shattering them. Arrows dotted its rotting flesh, but it showed no sign of slowing. Another giant, half of its skull missing, seized a broken section of the perimeter wall and hurled it aside. Tyrion's heart pounded. Scorpions! Now! The Scorpions' massive crossbow-like siege weapons were manned by a mixture of Black Brothers and wildlings. They cranked them back, each bolt tipped with dragonglass. A volley of giant bolts whooshed into the air. Some missed, vanishing into the storm. Others struck true, shattering one giant's ribcage into shards of bone and rot. The giant toppled, crushing dozens of wights beneath it. A cheer went up, only to die as more monstrosities emerged. Then Tyrion felt a chill deeper than any winter wind. A tall, slender shape glided forward, pale hair streaming in the storm. Another, an actual White Walker, astride a dead horse with hooves of black ice. Its eyes glowed an unholy blue. It raised a spear that shimmered with frost. From the next parapet over, an archer loosed a dragonglass arrow at the walker. The arrow streaked in, only to shatter a foot shy of the creature as if it had struck an invisible barrier of cold. The walker turned its head slowly toward the hapless archer. Then, with an almost languid motion, it hurled its spear of ice. The spear flew like lightning, impaling the man through the chest and pinning him to the wall. Frost spread from the wound, and the poor archer shrieked, body turning a sickly pale. Tyrion heard retching from nearby watchers, the horror too much for them. He gritted his teeth. They needed a champion with Valyrian steel or a well-placed dragonglass bolt. But the vantage was poor, and the walker was surrounded by wights, an entire cavalry of the dead. The Scorpions reloaded, men cursing under their breath. Another surge of wights battered the main gate, hacking with rusted weapons or clawing with skeletal hands. Oil poured down from above, the watchers igniting it with torches. Screams of burning wights filled the air. Tyrion thought his ears would burst from the cacophony of shrieks and the roar of flames. Yet the gate held for now. Movement to the east, a huddle of wights circled around, searching for a weak point. Tyrion shouted down to the men stationed there, warning them. They must keep every angle covered. Another volley of scorpion bolts took down a second giant, but two more advanced, smashing the stakes. The defenders rained fire arrows with frantic speed. So many wights fell, but more replaced them in an unceasing tide. Tyrion's mind raced. They had to break the control the others exerted. If they could kill enough walkers, some of these wights might collapse. He spotted at least 3 others amid the throng, each mounted, each carrying a weapon of ice. He scrambled to the nearest Scorpion crew. Aim for the Pale Riders, he barked, pointing. Dragonglass bolts carefully. The crew leader, a wildling with a shaved head, nodded and adjusted the weapon. The Scorpion creaked as it was aimed downward. Tyrion squinted through the swirling snow. The White Walker he'd picked out was circling near a cluster of wights that battered at the gatehouse. Loose! Tyrion shouted. The bolt soared. It missed by inches, instead striking a white horse in the flank. The horse and its rider collapsed, thrashing. The walker glided away unscathed. Tyrion cursed. Another attempt might be possible, but the walkers seemed to sense danger, moving with eerie grace. He clenched his fists. Reload. Time blurred in the chaos. The defenders shot volley after volley, men hoisting barrels of oil to the top of the wall to keep fueling the fires. Screams and groans echoed from every corner. Tyrion glimpsed Gorn below, hacking at a wight that had scaled part of the ramp. Where had it found purchase on the slick ice? Didn't matter. Gorn beheaded it with a fierce swing, the severed skull rolling into the flames. To the west, horns blared in alarm. Tyrion whirled, scanning the distance. Another contingent of the dead, perhaps? Or reinforcements? He couldn't tell. The storm churned. He saw flickers of movement, a swarm of wights in the gloom. The watchers there were fighting, the ring of stakes splintering. Gods be good, he muttered, forcing calm. We have to hold. From behind him came a rasping voice. Mara, clutching a bleeding arm, had climbed the steps. Lord Commander, the gatehouse is going to fail if the giants keep pounding it. We have to lure them away somehow. How? Tyrion snapped. We don't have a spare army lying around. Mara hissed in frustration. Maybe if we open a section of the wall, let them think they have an easier route. Tyrion shook his head. That might trap us all. But wait, he remembered something from the old records about tunnels that had been sealed. We do have an old Sally port on the eastern side, barely used. If we open it a crack, we might lure some of them, reduce pressure on the gate. It was a desperate gamble, any route for the enemy was a risk. But if the gate fell, Castle Black was lost. He grabbed Donal, who was manning a group of archers. Donal, gather a dozen men, Black Brothers or wildlings, I don't care. Arm them with torches, fire arrows, anything. Go to the old Sally port near the Warways. Mara will show you. Open it just enough to draw some of the wights away. Then burn them, collapse the tunnel behind you if you must. Understood. Donal paled but nodded. "Aye, my lord." He and Mera hurried off. Tyrion prayed they could manage it without being overrun. Below, the gatehouse shuddered as a giant slammed it with a colossal fist. Another giant stood nearby, flicking flaming arrows from its hide as if they were nets. The men stationed there were dangerously close to panic. Tyrion saw a few trying to flee inside. He bellowed at them from above, "Hold your ground." Some hesitated, but the threat of betraying their oath kept them in place. A hail of flaming arrows forced the giant back a step, but it roared and returned to the assault. Then Tyrion spotted it, one of the others dismounting its dead horse and walking calmly across a field of corpses, heading for the gate. Its frost blade glinted with lethal purpose. Tyrion realized it aimed to personally breach the gate. If a walker reached the gatehouse unopposed, it might freeze the hinges or slice through the defenders easily. Snatching a dragonglass-tipped crossbow from a startled ranger, Tyrion braced it on the icy rampart. The wind stung his eyes and his aim was unsteady, but he forced himself to focus. The White Walker glided closer, ignoring the carnage around it. Tyrion's heart hammered. He was no great shot, but he'd practiced with crossbows before. He held his breath, waited for the walker to come into a clearer line of sight. 10 yards, 8, 5. He fired. The bolt whistled through the air, burying itself in the walker's chest. There was a crack like ice fracturing underfoot, and for a heartbeat, the walker froze in place. Tyrion exhaled in triumph. He'd hit it. But the walker didn't shatter, not immediately. Instead, it let out a soundless scream, its form flickering as if caught between worlds. Then, slowly, it began to disintegrate, shards of frosty armor falling away. The frost blade dropped, shattering on impact. A moment later, the entire figure collapsed into a swirl of snow and hoarfrost. A ragged cheer rose from the defenders. Tyrion felt adrenaline spike in his veins. He'd done it. He'd killed a White Walker. He wanted to grin, but there was no time. All around, whites collapsed as the walker's magic dissipated, at least the whites it had directly animated. Dozens dropped where they stood, letting the defenders focus on the rest. It was a small but crucial reprieve. Men surged forward at the gate, hacking the remaining undead, pushing them back. The giant still posed a threat, but now it had no walker to guide it. Flames and repeated scorpion bolts eventually brought it crashing down, greenish ichor oozing from its wounds. The entire gatehouse trembled under the impact, but remained standing. Tyrion wiped sweat from his brow, ignoring the cold. One walker down, possibly 2 more out there leading the horde. If they could kill them as well, more whites would fall. But the swirling blizzard made it impossible to pinpoint their positions. The battle raged on. Archers and scorpions hammered the undead lines while the defenders on the ground formed tight ranks with torches and dragonglass spears. Smoke and the stench of burning flesh choked the air. Hour after hour, the undead advanced, trying to find weak points. Donnell's Sally Port gambit worked partially. A chunk of whites broke off to swarm that side, only to be funneled into a fiery kill zone. But the wall was vast and more whites circled around. The watchers struggled to hold multiple fronts. The uproar was deafening. Tyrion lost track of how many times he shouted for oil, for archers to shift positions, for men to stand firm. He glimpsed Gorn fighting alongside Black Brothers, his large axe cleaving whites with savage fury. He saw a northern lord, Karstark, hurling a torch into a cluster of undead. He saw a boy no older than 13 stabbing at a flaming white with a spear, tears streaming down his soot-streaked face. The living fought with a desperation that only came when extinction loomed. Eventually, the sun reached its zenith, though no warmth penetrated the swirling storm. The undead seemed endless. The watchers were exhausted. Tyrion felt his arms trembling whenever he tried to load another crossbow. He cursed, wishing for Jaime's prowess, or for the hound's raw power, or even for the cunning of Varys or Littlefinger to conjure some trick to end this. But no trick would defeat an enemy that never tired, never reasoned. Sometime in the early afternoon, though time was meaningless in the haze, a Black Brother shouted that he saw movement from the south. Reinforcements? The watchers looked, straining their eyes. Banners emerged from the swirling snowfall, though it was impossible to make out sigils until they drew closer. Then Tyrion's heart sank when he recognized the flayed man of House Bolton. The vile banner soared over a small army of horsemen and foot soldiers trudging north. Perhaps 200, maybe 3 at most. Enough to help, but not to turn the tide by themselves. "They're attacking our flank," an archer cried, panicking at the Bolton sigil's fearsome image. "No," Tyrion roared. "They've come to help us, let them pass." He only hoped that was true. The Boltons had pledged men after all. If they dared betray him in the midst of this apocalypse, they would be dooming themselves too. The Bolton force approached from the rear, forcing a path through a handful of whites that had circled wide. Tyrion watched them clash. The Boltons fought viciously with flails and spiked maces, hacking the whites apart. A small group carried torches. Despite the revulsion Tyrion felt for that sigil, he had to admit they were effective. Each time a white fell, it didn't rise. Soon, the remnants retreated to rejoin the main horde, leaving a path for the Boltons to reach Castle Black's southern approach. Tyrion dispatched men to open the south gate, really just a smaller gate in the perimeter wall. The Boltons flooded in, men panting and caked in frost. Their commander was a gaunt, pale man with watery eyes. "Your Lord Commander?" he demanded, voice tight. Tyrion descended from the rampart, still holding the crossbow that had felled the walker. "That would be me. Tyrion Lannister." A flicker of disgust crossed the man's face. No doubt the name Lannister was anathema to many in the north, but he quickly masked it. "I am Daron of House Bolton, sworn to the Dreadfort. We bring 300 men as promised. Where do you need us?" Tyrion almost laughed in relief and exhaustion. "Everywhere," he said simply, gesturing. "The undead are attacking on multiple fronts. Focus on the gatehouse or the western flank, wherever you see the need. Just kill whites." Daron nodded. "Yes, Lord Commander." He barked orders to his men. They spread out, moving to reinforce the lines. Gorn glowered at them from a distance, but he didn't interfere. The free folk hated the Boltons, but in this war, they fought side by side. Afternoon bled into evening. The sky turned a sickly gray, then deepened to navy blue. Still the battle raged. The Watchers had scorpion teams targeting the final White Walkers, but the swirling snow made it nearly impossible to get a clear shot. Tyrion glimpsed one walker weaving through the chaos, raising the dead who had fallen. Each time, more whites lurched to their feet. The men cursed and redoubled their efforts. Fires burned across the battlefield, the air thick with smoke. Charred remains littered the ground. The stench of death clogged every breath. Tyrion felt something in him fraying, a sense that no matter how many whites they slew, more kept coming. Could they truly outlast an enemy that replenished its ranks from their own fallen? The only hope was to kill the walkers themselves, to break the necromantic link. Late in the evening, a second respite came when the scorpions scored a lucky shot on one of the remaining walkers. Tyrion saw the bolt strike the creature's horse, unseating the walker, and a second bolt skewered it while it was on the ground. The walker exploded in a cloud of ice shards, its whites collapsing en masse. But that still left at least one more walker out there, possibly more. The undead host shrank in number each time, but enough remained to keep the defenders pinned. Night fell fully. Torches and braziers lit the wall. The men were nearly spent, but the whites showed no sign of retreat. Tyrion prayed for a miracle, that the final walker would reveal itself for a killing blow, or that an army from the south would arrive with fresh soldiers. But no new banners appeared on the horizon. They were on their own. Amid the carnage, Tyrion spotted the biggest giant yet, an enormous white with a missing jaw, lumbering toward the eastern rampart, the one near the sallyport. He realized with horror that if the giant battered its way through, the entire perimeter could collapse, letting the undead flood inside. He bellowed for a scorpion to pivot that way, but the crew was struggling with a jammed windlass. Below, a handful of wildlings and black brothers braced themselves to fight the giant. One launched a fire arrow that fizzled harmlessly off its leathery hide. Another ran forward with a dragonglass-tipped spear. The giant swatted the man aside like a toy, sending him flying. Tyrion bit his lip. They needed to kill that monster, or all was lost. Summoning his courage, Tyrion shouldered the crossbow and started down the nearest stair. He had only a few dragonglass bolts left, but perhaps he could land a shot at close range. "Stay up here, Lord Commander," a ranger shouted after him, but Tyrion ignored him. He was no swordsman, but with the crossbow maybe he could make a difference. He descended into chaos. Smoke stung his eyes. The ground was slippery with blood and ash. Whites lunged at him, but a pair of northern soldiers beat them back, shouting for him to hurry. Tyrion trudged forward, heart pounding, until he found the vantage he needed. The giant was less than 30 yards away, swinging its arm to crush a group of defenders. Flames flickered around it, casting grotesque shadows. Tyrion raised the crossbow, forced his hands steady, and fired. The bolt struck the giant high in the chest. It roared, reeling back, but did not fall. Tyrion cursed. He tried to reload, fumbling with numb fingers. The giant locked its dead eyes on him, letting out a roar that might once have been a voice. Now it was an unholy screech. It took a thunderous step forward, raising its massive club as if about to smash Tyrion flat. Tyrion braced for the end, but at that moment Gorn appeared from the side, leaping onto a pile of rubble. With a mighty swing, Gorn buried his axe in the giant's side, where Tyrion's bolt had struck. The giant bellowed, twisting, trying to grab Gorn. Tyrion seized the chance and fired again, his second bolt piercing the giant's neck. With a final shudder, the gargantuan wight collapsed, taking Gorn down in a tangle of limbs. "Gorn!" Tyrion shouted, rushing forward. Others joined him, hacking at the giant's thrashing arms. At last, the limbs went still. Tyrion saw Gorn pinned beneath the giant's massive torso, grimacing in pain. Men heaved and pulled, straining to roll the dead flesh aside. At last they succeeded, and Gorn crawled free, coughing. His leg bent at an ugly angle. "Little man," Gorn muttered, lips flecked with blood. "Good shot." Tyrion knelt, helping support Gorn's head. "And good swing," Tyrion said wryly, though his heart hammered in fear for the wildling leader's life. "We'll get you to Mullen." He gestured for a pair of men to carry Gorn away. Gorn half nodded, eyes glazing from pain. Tyrion bit his lip. If Gorn died, the free folk might lose hope. He had to live. Behind them, the battle raged on. The giant's fall gave the defenders a momentary lift, but the wight still battered at the walls. Tyrion had no time to dwell. He directed men to form a new perimeter around the collapsed giant, ensuring no smaller wights used the opening. And so it continued. The night felt endless, a swirl of death. Tyrion lost count of how many arrows he fired, how many times he heard men screaming for a mother who was never there. The White Walker that remained stayed elusive, orchestrating the undead from the edges. Without a direct shot, Tyrion could do little but keep killing wights. He found himself shoulder to shoulder with men he barely knew, some from the Vale, some from the Free Folk. They fought like beasts cornered because that was what they were. At one point, the Boltons forced a wedge into a cluster of wights trying to climb the eastern ramp. Tyrion was impressed despite himself by the savage discipline of their troops. Daeron had them in a tight formation, chopping wights apart, then burning the remains. The realm's most infamous house was playing hero if only for a night. Gradually, the tide of wights thinned as the Watchers' tireless onslaught burned them or hacked them down. Fires raged across the battlefield, turning snow to steaming slush. Corpses smoldered in heaps. The living began to push forward, clearing sections of the perimeter. Some parted in search of the final White Walker, hoping to deliver the killing blow. Then, in the first pale light of dawn, the horns sounded thrice. A hush fell. Men froze in terror. 3 blasts meant one thing, the others. But it was more than that. Tyrion heard the Watchers on the wall shouting, pointing at something in the northern sky. A shape moved there, vast, winged, wreathed in swirling snow. It emitted a roar that sounded like ice shattering. An ice dragon? Tyrion's blood ran cold. He had heard rumors from wildlings that the others had enslaved a dragon in the far north or resurrected one. Had it come to break the wall? A wave of panic surged through the defenders. Some men dropped their weapons, staring upward in horror. Through the swirling snow, Tyrion glimpsed an immense silhouette overhead, pale wings beating, exhaling a frosty breath that froze the air. A shape, someone or something, rode upon its back. Another White Walker, or the Night's King of Legends reborn. Tyrion's heart thundered. This was a threat beyond anything they had prepared for. Could wildfire even harm such a creature? He summoned what courage he had left. "Archers! Scorpions!" he bellowed. "Bring it down if you can." Men scrambled to comply, loading scorpion bolts with trembling hands, aiming upward. The ice dragon swooped low with a roar, frost swirling in a vortex behind it. Tyrion saw its maw open, unleashing a torrent of shimmering breath that coated part of the wall's upper rampart in glittering ice. Men shrieked as they were frozen solid. Stone cracked under the freezing shock. Bolts soared up, but the beast wheeled away with unnatural speed. Tyrion cursed. The final walker must be controlling it, using it to break their last line of defense. Another pass, and the creature might shatter the gatehouse or the top of the wall. Then the undead would flood through. He desperately looked for the shadowy rider. If a single dragonglass bolt or arrow could strike that figure, maybe the beast would fall. But the swirling snow made it impossible to get a clear shot. The ice dragon roared again, circling higher. Then, a scorpion near the center of the wall loosed a bolt. Tyrion watched it arc through the air, trailing a line of smoke from its flaming tip. For an instant, he dared hope it would strike true. But the dragon banked left, the bolt sailing past. Another near miss. The Watchers cursed, reloading. The ice dragon descended once more. This time, it aimed for the gatehouse, unleashing a blast of freezing breath. The stout timbers groaned, flash-frozen, their surfaces turning white with frost. Defenders scattered, some slipping on fresh ice. The whites below surged forward, sensing weakness. Tyrion realized with horror that the gate was compromised. Another blow might shatter it. He spun toward the nearest scorpion team. "Focus on the dragon," he roared, voice cracking with strain. "Now!" All across the wall, men tried. Bolts soared in a desperate barrage. Some flew wide. Some shattered on the creature's icy hide. A few struck but failed to penetrate deeply. Tyrion saw shards of frozen scorpion bolts tumbling away, useless. The beast was practically armor-plated with ice. Even dragonglass wasn't guaranteed to pierce so thick a barrier. Below, the final walker seemed to sense victory, driving the whites to the battered gatehouse. They hammered at the frozen wood. Splinters formed, cracks spreading. Tyrion saw the men stationed there backing away in terror. He needed one more miracle, one more shot at the walker, but it was lost in the chaos. Or if the walker was astride that dragon, unreachable. The ice dragon wheeled around again, going in for what looked like a final strike on the gatehouse. If it breathed its freezing flames once more, the gate might shatter entirely. The defenders would be overrun. Tyrion's chest felt tight. Was this the moment of doom? Suddenly, a horn blast from the south drew every eye. Tyrion spun around to see new shapes galloping into view, hundreds of them, banners whipping in the wind. The sigils were difficult to make out at first, but then he recognized some, the mermen of Manderley, the moose of Hornwood, even the moon and falcon of the Vale. A combined army from the southern north and the Vale? They poured across the field, smashing into the flank of the whites that massed near the gatehouse. A furious battle erupted, the newcomers surging with fresh horses and lances. Whites were trampled, scattered. Tyrion's heart soared momentarily. Reinforcements, bless the gods. They might not stop the ice dragon, but they could break the back of the horde on the ground. And if enough men with dragonglass arrows and spears advanced, they might pick out the final walker. Under the combined onslaught, arrows from the wall, the cavalry charge from the south, the whites near the gate faltered. They wavered as the new arrivals hacked them down in swathes. Tyrion thought he saw the Manderley banner at the forefront leading the charge. A fierce battle cry echoed. The whites tried to rally, but the living pressed in, forming a deadly ring. Above, the ice dragon let out a furious shriek as if sensing its plan unravel. It swooped lower, presumably to spew frost at the newcomers. Archers among the cavalry shot upward. Tyrion saw at least one arrow bury itself in the creature's flank, though it didn't seem enough to bring it down. The massive beast roared, thrashing in the air. Then it unleashed a torrent of freezing breath upon the cavalry, men and horses screaming as they froze mid-gallop. Bodies shattered like glass. Tyrion's stomach churned, horror pricking his eyes with tears. But in that moment, the scorpion teams on the wall found their opening. While the dragon was occupied, they re-aimed carefully. Tyrion glimpsed 3 separate scorpions let fly simultaneously, bolts streaking like fiery comets. One missed entirely, but 2 struck the dragon's flank with solid impacts. The creature shrieked, flailing. Icy shards flew. Tyrion saw cracks forming along its pale hide. It beat its wings furiously, rising higher, trying to escape. One more bolt soared, a lucky shot from the western scorpion. It struck near the dragon's neck, lodging deep. The beast's roar rose to a piercing shriek. It thrashed in the air, losing altitude. Men on the ground scattered. Then, with a thunderous crash, the ice dragon plummeted into the field outside Castle Black, smashing a dozen whites beneath it. A shockwave of ice splintered outward, felling more undead. Tyrion watched, breathless. The dragon convulsed, its pale body cracking like glass. The air filled with a sound like grinding glaciers. Then, in a final keening roar, the ice dragon burst apart in a flurry of frozen shards scattering across the battlefield. Where it fell, dozens of whites collapsed instantly as if their animating power had been tied to the dragon's presence. A stunned silence followed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Tyrion blinked. The last White Walker, had it died with the dragon, or did it stand somewhere among the carnage? He scanned the field. There, an inhuman figure rose from the shards, staggering. It was indeed the walker, badly wounded, its icy form cracked. Another scorpion bolt soared in from the rampart, but missed. The walker turned as if to flee. From the ranks of the newly arrived cavalry, a figure on horseback galloped forth, Lord Wyman Manderley himself? Tyrion couldn't tell. The rider wore heavy plate, bearing a sword that gleamed with an odd blue sheen. Perhaps Valyrian steel. With a mighty swing, the rider cleaved the walker in half. The White Walker exploded in a shower of frost, and in that instant, nearly all the remaining whites collapsed. A great moan echoed through the battlefield as undead bodies slumped, lifeless once more. For a moment, none of the defenders moved or spoke. They were too spent, too shocked. Then a roaring cheer erupted, surging from the gatehouse, the wall, the cavalry, even from the wildlings. Tyrion nearly collapsed against the parapet in relief. They had done it. The other's army was broken, at least this wave. The final White Walker leading this horde was destroyed and the ice dragon with it. Men wept openly, falling to their knees. Some laughed in delirium. Others sank down in exhaustion beside piles of corpses. Tyrion pressed a hand to his chest, feeling his heart flutter like a trapped bird. He glanced at the remains of the battlefield, mountains of scorched bodies, puddles of melted snow, shattered ice crystals glinting in the dawn light. They had paid a terrible price, but they had survived. He turned and saw Gorn being carried on a makeshift stretcher, alive but barely conscious. He saw Donal leaning on his spear, bleeding from a cut above his eye. He saw black brothers embracing wildlings in a haze of relief. Up on the wall, archers sagged against the battlements, tears steaming on their faces in the cold air. The newly arrived cavalry dismounted, some retching at the grisly sight, others kneeling to deliver mercy to half-dead wights. Tyrion forced himself to straighten. He had to be strong for them. He began the grim work of organizing a cleanup, burn the bodies, tend the wounded, ensure no stray wight might rise. But before he could even speak, a wave of euphoria and disbelief washed over the courtyard. Men crowded around him, praising him, calling him the little lion or the dwarf commander. He tried to wave them away. "We still have tasks, eh? The tasks can wait," roared a free-folk warrior. "We're alive. Thanks to you and these new southern riders." Tyrion shook his head. "No, we won because we all fought together. Now keep your wits." But gratitude shone in their eyes. And for once, Tyrion let himself feel a spark of pride. He had never expected to lead an army, never expected to be a hero. But here he was, standing among the battered victors of the greatest battle the Wall had seen in generations. He climbed down to the gatehouse area, where the leaders of the new forces were gathering. Wyman Manderly, a massive man in armor that strained at the clasps, greeted him with a hearty clasp on the shoulder. "Lord Tyrion," Manderly said, huffing breath, "we came as fast as we could. By the Seven, that was a sight. A dragon made of ice. If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd call it madness." Tyrion managed a weary smile. "Madness indeed, Lord Manderly. But we're grateful for your arrival. You turned the tide." Manderly nodded gravely. "We lost many good men in that final charge, but we're proud to stand with the Watch." He gestured to the scattered riders behind him. Some wore sigils of the Vale, so Peter Baelish must have sent a contingent as well, or the Lords of the Vale had come independently. "We're all that's left of the Northern Coalition I mustered. More may arrive behind us, if they survive the roads." Tyrion looked out at the scorched battlefield, still in disbelief at the scale of what they'd just endured. "Then we'll welcome them," he said softly. "There's no guarantee the others won't send another army. But for now, we've won a reprieve." Manderly exhaled, glancing at the wreckage of the ice dragon's remains, which were rapidly melting in the weak sunlight. "A reprieve. Let us hope it lasts." Tyrion thought of Jaime again, a pang hitting his chest. That memory would never leave him. But at least this day, Tyrion had led the living to victory, avenging his brother in a sense. He had upheld the vow of the Night's Watch, proved that even the smallest man could cast a large shadow when duty called. As men cheered and wept, as the smoke of funeral pyres drifted into a sky stained pink and gold by the feeble sunrise, Tyrion Lannister turned to face the battered remains of the realm's defenders. He raised his voice so that as many as possible might hear. "Brothers, wildlings, northerners, you have fought with a courage that songs will never fully capture. We've turned back this army of the dead, but let us not forget those who fell, for they gave their lives so that we might stand here breathing. And we must remain vigilant, for the others may yet return. But for this moment we stand triumphant. The Wall still holds." A thunder of voices rose in response, a mingling of cheers and sobs, curses and prayers. Tyrion felt the tears burn at the corners of his eyes but held them at bay. He had to be their pillar, their anchor. Looking around at the swirl of carnage and relief, he realized that this was how the world changed, not through crowns on heads in King's Landing, nor whispered deals in the back halls, but through desperate men and women uniting against a common terror. They would have to keep uniting, keep standing together if they hoped to weather the full fury of the long night. But for now they had earned a sliver of dawn. Tyrion clenched his fists and gazed at the rising sun. He could almost feel Jaime's spirit there, an unseen presence in the light. "We did it, brother," he whispered, voice choked with emotion. For once, the dwarf made a difference. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of that victory wash over him. However fleeting, it was real. Then he opened them and joined the men in the rubble-strewn courtyard to begin the long work of rebuilding and burying the dead, forging alliances anew. He was Tyrion Lannister, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and he would guard this realm against every horror the cold winds could bring for as long as breath filled his lungs. And if the others rose again with even greater fury, he would meet them at the wall once more, crossbow in hand, which sharpened like Valyrian steel, a dwarf too stubborn to surrender. In that stand, he had found his truest place, and the realm, whether it knew it or not, had found a champion in the unlikeliest of men.